Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. The sound came out of nowhere, a scream so piercing and desperate it stopped me dead in my tracks. I'd been patrolling the northern edge of Crystal Lake, doing my usual rounds, when the air around me seemed to thicken with a strange, unnatural quiet. The birds, the wind, even the creaking branches, everything had gone still. It was the kind of silence you only experience when something isn't right. Then the scream, echoing, jagged, and too real to ignore. I turned to Jacob, who was a few paces ahead. His face had drained of color, eyes wide. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. We both knew we had to go. Fast. We'd gotten a call earlier that afternoon. A group of teenagers had set up camp near the far side of the lake, and their parents hadn't heard from them in over 24 hours. Not unusual for a bunch of teens with no signal, probably too busy making TikToks or whatever kids do these days. But this scream, it wasn't normal. We sprinted down the path toward the source, feet crunching on the gravel trail. The closer we got to the lake, the more something gnawed at the back of my mind. It wasn't just the scream. There was a feeling in the air, like the woods were holding their breath. The clearing where they'd set up camp came into view. Jacob and I slowed down, taking in the scene. Tents, 2 of them, pitched haphazardly, like they'd been abandoned in a hurry. A fire pit still smoldering faintly, but no kids. Not a single one. "Where the hell did they go?" Jacob muttered, his voice low, almost like he didn't want the trees to hear. I walked toward the nearest tent, the one closest to the water's edge. The flap was half open, flapping gently in the breeze. Inside it was a mess, clothes strewn across the floor, sleeping bags twisted into knots, backpacks half-zipped and spilling out their contents. No signs of violence, just chaos, panic, maybe. I straightened up, my breath coming a little faster than I wanted to admit. "Jacob, check this out." He walked over, his boots crunching loudly on the rocky shore. I pointed to the edge of the water, just a few feet from the tent. There in the mud were tracks, massive, deep tracks that looked like they belonged to. I don't even know what. They were long, with claws, too big to be a bear, too strange to be anything else I could think of. Jacob crouched down, running his fingers along the edges of the tracks. He didn't say anything for a long moment, then slowly stood, his jaw tight. "This isn't right," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What the hell makes tracks like that?" I didn't have an answer. The prints led from the water, circling the tents, and then nothing. They just stopped. We spent the next hour combing through the campsite. It didn't make sense. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle, just those massive prints, and the sense that whatever happened here happened fast. Too fast for anyone to react. Jacob radioed back to base, telling them we had a missing person situation. They'd send a search team, but I knew it'd be a few hours before anyone could get to this part of the lake. We were alone for now. The sun was starting to sink behind the trees, casting long shadows over the water. The air was getting cooler, and with it, a sense of unease started to settle in my chest. Jacob was pacing by the shore, his eyes scanning the tree line, like he expected something to burst out at any moment. "Let's check the perimeter one more time," I said, trying to shake off the heavy feeling settling over me. Jacob nodded, and we split up, circling the camp in opposite directions. As I moved further away from the water, the trees grew thicker, the underbrush more tangled. The fading light made everything look different. Shadows stretched in odd directions, and the wind carried strange, soft sounds I couldn't quite place. That's when I found the first piece of real evidence, a cell phone, lying half-buried under some leaves just beyond the edge of the camp. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The screen was cracked, but it still flickered to life when I pressed the button. The lock screen showed a girl, maybe 16 or 17, smiling with a group of friends. One of the missing teens, no doubt. I pocketed the phone and continued walking, keeping my eyes on the ground for any more clues. That's when I saw it. A figure, just at the edge of my vision, moving between the trees. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. It was tall, too tall to be human, and it moved quickly, almost gliding through the forest. My brain scrambled to make sense of it, a trick of the light, maybe, my tired eyes playing games with me. "Jacob," I called out, but my voice felt swallowed by the trees. I started moving toward where I saw the figure, my flashlight now cutting through the growing darkness. As I pushed through the brush, the feeling of being watched became impossible to ignore. Every instinct in my body screamed that I shouldn't be out here, that whatever was moving in these woods was something I didn't want to meet. Then I found something else. Another track, huge, clawed, just like the ones by the water, and next to it, a torn piece of fabric, dark with something that looked disturbingly like blood. I crouched down, my stomach churning. The air felt thick around me, heavy with something I couldn't name. I heard a snap, a twig breaking somewhere close, and whipped my head around. But there was nothing there, just the forest, the darkness, and that growing, gnawing sense that something was wrong. I backed away, my pulse quickening. I had to get back to the camp, back to Jacob. Whatever was out here, we couldn't take it on alone, not without more information. But as I turned to head back, the sound came again, a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere deep in the trees. It wasn't a bear. I'd heard bears before, and this was different, more deliberate, almost intelligent. I forced myself to keep walking, quickening my pace, but trying not to make too much noise. Every crunch of leaves under my boots felt deafening in the quiet. Suddenly, Jacob's voice crackled over the radio. "Mike, where are you?" "I think I see something." I grabbed the radio, my hands shaking. "I'm coming back, don't move. There's something out here." But as soon as I said it, I heard it. Another scream. This one wasn't distant. It wasn't coming from some unknown part of the forest. It was Jacob. I broke into a run, crashing through the underbrush, my flashlight bouncing wildly in front of me. I heard him again, shouting my name, followed by more sounds of struggle. Branches breaking, something huge moving through the trees. When I reached the camp, it was chaos. The tents had been flattened, the fire pit completely destroyed. Jacob was on the ground, scrambling backward as something enormous loomed over him. It was hard to see clearly, but the shape, it was massive, covered in matted fur. Its eyes glinted in the fading light, animalistic but with a terrifying intelligence behind them. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I could recognize. Before I could even think, I rushed forward, yelling, trying to distract it. The thing turned its head toward me, and in that moment, I saw its full form. Standing upright, towering over Jacob, with claws longer than my hand and a face that was almost human, but not. It let out a snarl, then moved faster than anything that size should have been able to. I grabbed Jacob by the arm, pulling him to his feet, and we ran. We didn't look back. We just ran, crashing through the trees, not caring about the noise anymore. Whatever that thing was, it was hunting us, and I wasn't going to let it catch us. We reached the ranger station just as the search team arrived. Out of breath, bloodied and terrified, we tried to explain what we'd seen. But how do you describe something like that? How do you tell people that something beyond reason lives out in those woods? They searched for the kids, but no bodies were ever found. Just those massive tracks, circling the camp and disappearing into the depths of the forest. And the scream, sometimes I still hear it, echoing in the back of my mind, reminding me that whatever's out there, it's still waiting. Story 2. I've been a forest ranger for 15 years. And I've seen my fair share of strange things in the woods, but nothing could have prepared me for that night in October when I encountered something that defied explanation, something that still haunts my dreams and makes me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where your breath hangs in the air and the forest floor crackles under your boots. I was on a routine night patrol, checking for illegal campers and making sure no fires had been left unattended. The moon was full, casting long shadows through the trees, and an eerie silence had settled over the forest. I'd been hearing reports from hikers and campers about strange noises and large, dark shapes moving through the trees. Most of the time, these turn out to be nothing more than a bear or a particularly bold deer. But there was something different about these reports. The fear in people's voices when they described what they'd seen. It stuck with me. As I made my way along the hiking trail, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest felt too quiet, too still. Even the nocturnal animals seemed to be holding their breath. That's when I heard it. A crack of branches breaking underfoot, too loud to be a small animal. I swung my flashlight in the direction of the sound, my heart rate picking up. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast darkness. "This is Ranger Sarah. Is anyone there?" No response, just another snap of branches, closer this time. I reached for my radio, intending to call for backup. But when I pressed the button, all I got was static. I frowned, tapping the device against my palm. It had been working fine earlier in the evening. Another crack, this time accompanied by a low, rumbling sound that I felt more than heard. It vibrated through my chest, setting my teeth on edge. This was no bear. No animal I knew made a sound like that. I took a step back, my flashlight beam dancing erratically as my hand shook. "Whoever's out there, show yourself." I tried to sound authoritative, but my voice wavered. That's when I saw it. A massive shape, moving between the trees about 50 yards ahead. My flashlight caught it for just a moment, illuminating dark, matted fur and the flash of eyes reflecting the light. But it was the size that struck me. This thing was huge, at least 8 feet tall and moving on 2 legs. I froze, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. It couldn't be real. There was no animal that big in these woods. But as I stood there, paralyzed with shock and fear, the creature turned its head and looked directly at me. Those eyes, they weren't animal eyes. There was an intelligence there, a presence that sent chills down my spine. For a long moment, we stared at each other, neither moving. Then, with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large, it vanished into the darkness. I don't know how long I stood there. My flashlight pointed at the spot where the creature had been. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold on to it. Part of me wanted to run, to get as far away from that thing as possible. But another part, the ranger part, knew I had to investigate. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to move forward. The forest seemed to close in around me, every shadow potentially hiding that massive shape. I swept my flashlight back and forth, searching for any sign of the creature. As I approached the area where I'd seen it, I noticed the smell, a musky animal odor, but mixed with something else, something almost human. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I had to fight the urge to turn and run. That's when my flashlight began to flicker. I tapped it against my palm, but the beam continued to weaken. Within seconds, I was plunged into darkness. Panic seized me. I fumbled for the spare batteries in my pocket, my fingers clumsy with fear. As I struggled to change them, I heard movement in the underbrush around me. Something was circling, getting closer. I managed to get the new batteries in, but when I flicked the switch, nothing happened. The flashlight was dead. I was alone in the dark, with something big and unknown closing in. My training kicked in, and I forced myself to breathe slowly, to listen. The forest was alive with sounds now, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and that low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from all directions at once. I backed up slowly, trying to remember the direction of the trail. But in the darkness, with the sounds of movement all around me, I quickly became disoriented. My back hit a tree, and I pressed against it, trying to make myself as small as possible. The growling grew louder, closer. I could hear heavy breathing, smell that musky odor growing stronger. Whatever it was right in front of me. I closed my eyes, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. This was it. This was how I was going to die. But then, as suddenly as it had started, the noises stopped. The forest fell silent once again. I stood there, pressed against the tree, for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to even breathe. Slowly, cautiously, I opened my eyes. The first rays of dawn were starting to filter through the trees, casting a grey light over the forest. And there, not 10 feet in front of me, was a set of footprints. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boot. But it wasn't just the size that was shocking. The shape was all wrong. Too elongated, with what looked like claw marks at the ends of the toes, and the stride length. Whatever made these prints had been moving on 2 legs, with a gait far longer than any human's. I stared at those footprints as the sun rose, trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. Part of me wanted to believe it had all been a dream, a hallucination brought on by stress and too many late-night patrols. But the evidence was right there in front of me, pressed into the damp earth. As soon as I could, I radioed for backup. When my colleagues arrived, I showed them the footprints. They were skeptical at first, suggesting it might be a bear or maybe a hoax. But as we followed the trail of prints deeper into the forest, their doubts began to fade. We found more evidence. Trees with bark stripped off at heights no known animal could reach. Strange hair samples caught on low-hanging branches, and always that musky, almost human scent lingering in the air. We searched for days, but found no further sign of the creature. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. But I know what I saw that night. I know what I heard, what I smelled. There's something out there in those woods, something that shouldn't exist, but does. Something that defies explanation and challenges everything we think we know about the natural world. I still patrol those trails. It's my job, after all. But now, when night falls and the shadows grow long, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. That somewhere out there, in the darkness between the trees, a pair of intelligent, all too human eyes are following my every move. And I wonder, with a mix of fear and fascination, when I might encounter it again. Because one thing's for certain, that night changed everything. And whatever's out there, it's only a matter of time before it makes itself known once more. Until then, I'll keep watching the woods, and hoping that next time, I'm better prepared for what I might find. Story 3. The first thing I noticed was the blood. It wasn't much at first, a few smears on the rocks here and there. Tom, walking just ahead of me, hadn't even spotted it. But I had, and something about it didn't sit right. Blood in the wilderness wasn't uncommon, sure. Animals got into fights. Predators hunted their prey. But this was different. It wasn't the scattered, chaotic splatter of a natural struggle. This was deliberate, like something had been dragged. "Hey, Tom," I called, my voice coming out more tense than I intended. He turned, glancing at me over his shoulder. "What's up?" I pointed to the ground, where another thick streak of blood glistened against the rocks. His eyes followed my gesture, and his expression shifted from relaxed to focused in an instant. "That's not good," he muttered, stepping closer. Tom wasn't easily rattled. He'd been hiking these trails for years, seen his fair share of weird things out in the wilderness, but I could tell this was different. We were hiking Black Mountain, a remote and rugged stretch of wilderness that was known more for its challenging trails than anything else. We'd planned the trip for weeks, excited for a chance to escape the grind of everyday life. But now, standing here in the growing shadows of the forest, something felt off, like the mountain itself was watching us. Tom knelt down, touching the edge of the blood trail with his fingers. "Still fresh," I swallowed hard. "What do you think it is?" "A deer." He didn't answer right away, eyes scanning the trail ahead. "Maybe, but if it was a deer, something must have taken it down recently, and whatever did this, it's big." That's when I noticed the tracks. Huge, deep impressions in the dirt, like something heavy had passed through. The prints were strange, though, long, with claws at the ends, but not quite right for a bear. They looked wrong, almost as if something had been walking on two legs. "Look at these tracks," I said, pointing. Tom joined me, frowning. Not a bear, definitely not a mountain lion either. "Then what?" I asked, my voice hushed like I didn't want the trees to overhear. He didn't answer, just stood there, staring down at the massive footprints, his jaw clenched. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, and the shadows around us grew longer, more menacing. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested, trying to keep the nervous edge out of my voice. Tom shook his head. "We're close to the summit. Let's check it out, then turn around. We'll be fine." I didn't argue, but a pit had started to form in my stomach. Something was wrong out here. I could feel it. The usual sounds of the forest, the birds, the rustling leaves, had gone silent. All I could hear was the wind through the trees and our boots crunching on the dirt. We followed the trail, climbing higher as the bloodstains became more frequent. The further we went, the more disturbing the scene became. At one point, we passed a broken branch, splintered and hanging at an odd angle. Blood smeared across the bark. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't natural. As we reached a plateau, I noticed the view was breathtaking. The mountains stretched out below us, bathed in the fading light of the setting sun. But the beauty of the scene was lost on me. My eyes were glued to the ground, where the trail of blood led to a cluster of boulders a few yards away. "Tom," I whispered, pointing again. He followed my gaze and froze. There, between the boulders, was the source of the blood. A deer, or at least what was left of it, torn apart in a way that no natural predator would have done. Its body was ripped open, limbs twisted at unnatural angles, and the tracks, the massive, clawed tracks, circled the carcass like something had taken its time. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air was thick with the scent of iron and decay, and I could feel the weight of the wilderness pressing down on me. "We need to go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Tom didn't argue this time. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the remains of the deer. "Yeah, we need to get the hell out of here." We turned to leave, but the second we did, I heard it. A low, guttural growl, so deep I could feel it vibrating in my chest. We froze, not daring to move. I glanced at Tom, his face stiff with fear. Slowly, I turned my head toward the trees, the direction the sound had come from. At first, I saw nothing, just the thick underbrush, the shadows growing longer with every passing second. But then, something shifted in the darkness. A shape, massive, hunched, and moving silently through the trees. It was hard to make out in the fading light, but I could see enough. It wasn't an animal, not one I'd ever seen anyway. The creature was tall, unnaturally tall, moving with a fluidity that didn't belong to something so large. Its fur, dark and matted, blended with the shadows, but I could make out the shape of its arms, long and sinewy, with claws that glinted in the last rays of the sun. "Run," Tom whispered, his voice shaking. I didn't need to be told twice. We bolted, sprinting down the trail as fast as our legs could carry us. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear Tom right behind me, his footsteps quick and frantic, but I could also hear something else. Something big, crashing through the trees, gaining on us. I didn't dare look back. The trail was steep, the ground uneven, and my legs were burning with the effort of keeping pace. But the only thing that mattered was getting as far away from that thing as possible. The growls grew louder, closer. I could feel it, whatever it was, right behind us. "Go! Don't stop!" Tom yelled, his voice strained. I pushed harder, the adrenaline surging through my veins. I didn't think about the pain, or the fear, or how close that thing was. I just ran. The trail curved sharply, and for a brief moment, I lost sight of Tom. Panic flared in my chest, but I kept going, my feet pounding the dirt. Then I heard it, a loud crash followed by a scream. "Tom!" I yelled, skidding to a halt. I turned, my breath coming in ragged gasps. There, in the clearing behind me, Tom was on the ground, one leg twisted beneath him, his face contorted in pain. And towering over him, half hidden by the trees, was the creature. It was massive, its body hunched and covered in thick, matted fur. Its eyes, dark and gleaming, were locked on Tom, and its jaws were open, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth. It wasn't an animal, it was something else, something that shouldn't exist. Without thinking, I grabbed the nearest rock and hurled it at the creature. It didn't even flinch, but it did turn its gaze toward me, its eyes narrowing as it let out a low, rumbling growl that shook me to my core. "Get up!" I screamed at Tom, backing away slowly. Tom groaned, trying to push himself up, but his leg was clearly broken. I could see the pain etched across his face, and the realization hit me hard. There was no way he could run, and I couldn't leave him behind. The creature took a step toward me, its claws digging into the ground with each movement. It was playing with us, stalking us like prey. My mind raced, searching for any possible way out of this. But there was nothing, just us, the creature, and the vast wilderness surrounding us. Then, out of nowhere, a loud crack echoed through the trees, a gunshot. The creature flinched, its head snapping in the direction of the sound. Another shot rang out, and this time the thing let out a guttural snarl before turning and disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had come. I stood there, frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. It took a moment for me to realize that help had arrived. A pair of park rangers emerged from the trees, rifles in hand, their faces grim. "Are you guys okay?" one of them called out, rushing toward us. I collapsed onto the ground, the adrenaline finally wearing off. Tom was still groaning in pain, but he was alive. We were alive. Barely. The rangers helped us to our feet, checking Tom's leg and assuring us that they'd radio for a medevac. But as they led us down the trail, one of them glanced back at the darkening forest, his face pale. "What the hell was that thing?" I asked, my voice shaky. The ranger didn't answer. He just shook his head, his expression unreadable. "We don't know," he finally said, "but you're not the first to see it." Story 4. I've always been a skeptic. Bigfoot, aliens, ghosts, I never bought into any of it. But after what happened that weekend in the Cascade Mountains, I'm not so sure anymore. Some things just can't be explained away, no matter how hard you try. My name's Mike, and I've been best friends with John since college. We tried to go camping at least once a year, just to get away from the noise and stress of city life. This time, we decided to hike deep into the backcountry, to an area known for its Sasquatch sightings. John's always been into that stuff, and I figured it'd be good for a laugh. We set out early on a Friday morning, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. The trail was rough and rarely used, winding through ancient forests of towering cedars and firs. By late afternoon, we'd left all signs of civilization behind. "This is it," John said, consulting his GPS. "This is where all those sightings have been reported." I rolled my eyes. "Great. I'm sure Bigfoot will be by to welcome us any minute now." We found a small clearing near a babbling stream and set up camp. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination, fueled by John's endless Sasquatch tales. After a dinner of freeze-dried pasta and instant coffee, we sat around the campfire, sharing stories and enjoying the solitude. That's when we heard it. A series of loud, rhythmic knocks echoing through the forest. John's eyes widened. "Wood knocking," he whispered. "It's one of the signs." I laughed it off. Probably just a woodpecker with insomnia. But as the night wore on, the sounds continued, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. And then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, circling our campsite just beyond the reach of our firelight. "Hello," I called out, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "Is someone there?" No response. Just more footsteps, and now a low, rumbling growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. John and I looked at each other, fear plain on both our faces. This was no bear, no cougar. Whatever was out there was big, and it was watching us. We spent a sleepless night in the tent, listening to those heavy footsteps and occasional growls. By the time dawn broke, I was a nervous wreck. As soon as it was light enough, we emerged from the tent. What we saw made my blood run cold. All around our campsite were footprints, huge, human-like prints that must have been at least 16 inches long. They circled our tent, came right up to the fire pit, even stopped by our backpacks. "Holy shit," I breathed, staring at a print that dwarfed my own boot. "John, what the hell made these?" John was practically vibrating with excitement and fear. "You know what made them, Mike. We've got to follow the trail, see where they lead." Every instinct told me to pack up and get the hell out of there, but curiosity won out. We quickly ate some energy bars, filled our water bottles, and set off following the trail of massive footprints. The prints led us deeper into the forest, away from any marked trails. The trees grew denser, the underbrush thicker. More than once, I stumbled over hidden roots or rocks. "John, maybe we should turn back," I said, after nearly twisting my ankle for the third time. "We're going to get lost." But John was like a man possessed, pushing forward with a determination I'd never seen in him before. "We're close, Mike. I can feel it." That's when we heard the scream. It wasn't human, wasn't any animal I'd ever heard before. It was a high, keening wail that echoed through the trees, setting birds to flight and sending shivers down my spine. "What the fuck was that?" I gasped, grabbing John's arm. He just shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know, but it came from up ahead." We pressed on, moving more cautiously now. The forest had gone eerily quiet, as if every living thing was holding its breath. We came to a small clearing and stopped short. There, in the center, was a crude structure made of broken branches and leaves. It looked like a nest, big enough for something very large to sleep in. "A Sasquatch bed," John whispered, his voice filled with awe. "Mike, do you know how rare this is? There are only a handful of documented cases of—" His words were cut off by another scream, this one so close it seemed to vibrate the air around us. And then we saw it, a massive dark shape moving through the trees on the other side of the clearing. I caught a glimpse of matted fur, of long arms that hung below the knees. And then it was gone, vanishing into the forest with a speed and silence that seemed impossible for something so large. We stood there, frozen in shock and fear, for I don't know how long. Finally, John spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get out of here. Now." I didn't argue. We turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, with no regard for stealth or direction. All that mattered was putting as much distance between us and that thing as possible. By some miracle, we found our way back to our campsite, but what we saw there stopped us in our tracks. Our tent was shredded, the fabric torn to ribbons. Our backpacks had been ripped open, their contents strewn about the clearing. And there, scratched deep into the trunk of a nearby tree, were 3 long parallel marks, claw marks from something with hands far larger than any humans. "Jesus," I breathed, taking in the destruction. "John, what the hell are we dealing with here?" But John didn't answer. He was staring at something on the ground near what remained of our tent. I followed his gaze and felt my heart skip a beat. There, half buried in the soft earth, was a footprint. But this one was different from the others we'd seen. It was clearer, more defined. I could make out individual toe impressions, the arch of the foot, even what looked like dermal ridges, fingerprints, but on a foot. "That's not possible," I said, my voice shaking. "Nothing could leave a print like that. Nothing real." John knelt down, reaching out to touch the print with trembling fingers. "It's real, Mike. It's all real. Everything I've been saying, everything you've been laughing off for years, it's all true." I wanted to argue, to find some rational explanation for what we'd seen and heard. But I couldn't. The evidence was right there in front of us, undeniable and terrifying. We didn't bother trying to salvage our gear. We just ran, following the trail back towards civilization, constantly looking over our shoulders. More than once, I thought I caught glimpses of something large moving through the trees parallel to us, keeping pace effortlessly. It was nearly dark by the time we reached the trailhead and my car. We threw ourselves in, and I drove like a madman, not stopping until we were back in the city, surrounded by the comforting lights and sounds of the world we knew. We reported what happened to the park rangers, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They promised to investigate, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. Whatever was out there in those woods, it didn't want to be found. It's been months since that weekend, and I still have nightmares about those footsteps circling our tent, about that inhuman scream echoing through the trees. John's thrown himself into researching Sasquatch sightings, convinced that what we encountered is the key to proving their existence. As for me, I'm not sure what to believe anymore. I know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt, but I also know that it goes against everything I thought I knew about the world. One thing's for certain, though, I won't be going camping again anytime soon. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, some questions better left unasked, because once you've glimpsed what's hiding in the dark spaces between the trees, you can never truly feel safe in the woods again. Story 5. The scream was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, sharp, jagged, and so full of raw terror that it stopped me cold. I'd been working as a park ranger for nearly 10 years, and in that time, I'd heard my fair share of odd sounds in the wilderness. But this was different. There was something in that scream that clawed its way under my skin, stirring an ancient, primal fear. I stood still, the wind cutting through the trees around me, bringing with it the scent of pine and damp earth. The radio on my belt crackled to life. "Charlie, did you hear that?" My supervisor's voice, Mike, sounded tight, strained. He'd heard it too. "Yeah, I heard it," I replied, my own voice steadier than I felt. "Came from the far end of Shadow Valley, didn't it?" That's what I thought. "I'm sending a team out there, but it'll take some time to mobilize. You're the closest. Can you head over and check it out?" A part of me wanted to say no, wanted to turn around, walk back to the station, and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But that wasn't my job, and something in me knew I wouldn't be able to sleep tonight if I didn't at least check it out. "On my way," I said, already turning toward the direction of the scream. Shadow Valley was a remote part of the park, a place that most visitors didn't venture into. The trails were poorly maintained, and the dense trees blocked out most of the sunlight, even in the middle of the day. It had always felt different from the rest of the park, like the shadows stretched just a little longer there, the air a little heavier. As I made my way through the underbrush, the eerie silence of the forest weighed on me. The usual sounds of birds, insects, even the rustling of small animals were gone. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I reached the clearing where the scream had come from, my heart thudding hard in my chest. What I saw there sent a cold wave of dread washing over me. The campsite was a wreck, 2 tents, both torn apart as if something or someone had ripped through them with violent force. Camping gear was scattered everywhere, clothes, backpacks, a portable stove, all tossed around like toys. The fire pit was still warm, embers glowing faintly in the fading light of the late afternoon, but there were no people, no sign of the campers themselves. I moved slowly, cautiously, trying to take everything in without missing any details. There was something else, too. Massive tracks, huge, deep impressions in the dirt that circled the camp. The prints were unlike anything I'd seen before, long, clawed, and impossibly large. Too big to be a bear, too different to belong to any animal I could think of. My gut twisted. I pulled out my radio. "Mike, I'm at the site. It's bad." "Define bad, Charlie." I took a breath, trying to steady my voice. "Campsite's been torn apart. No sign of the campers. But there are tracks. Big ones." "Bear?" I looked at the prints again, my stomach churning. No, not a bear. I don't know what made these. There was a long pause on the other end of the radio. Stay put. Backup's on the way. I clipped the radio back to my belt and stood there, my eyes scanning the tree line. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows across the clearing, making everything feel more claustrophobic. I didn't want to wait here, exposed. I needed to do something, anything, to distract myself from the gnawing sense of unease that was creeping up my spine. I walked toward one of the tents, crouching down to get a closer look. The fabric was shredded, torn open from the outside. Whatever had done this had been strong enough to rip through canvas like paper. There were bloodstains on the ground, small splatters that led off into the trees. My heart skipped a beat. Maybe the campers had tried to run. Maybe they were hurt but alive. I followed the trail of blood, my hand resting on the hilt of the knife at my belt, though I wasn't sure how much good it would do against whatever had done this. The further I went, the thicker the trees became, and the darker the forest seemed to grow. The shadows moved strangely, twisting in the corners of my vision. But when I turned my head, there was nothing there. The blood trail led me to a small ridge, where the ground sloped downward into a dense thicket of trees. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. There, at the bottom of the ridge, was something big, a shape, dark and hunched over, almost blending into the shadows. It was hard to make out from this distance, but it looked like it was crouching over something that wasn't moving. I swallowed hard, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to get out of here, but I couldn't. I had to know what had happened. I had to know if anyone was still alive. I crept down the ridge as quietly as I could, keeping low to the ground, my eyes locked on the figure below. As I got closer, the details became clearer. The thing was massive, at least 7 feet tall, with matted, dark fur covering its body. It was hunched over the remains of something, its massive hands stained with blood. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. The creature's head lifted slightly, and I saw its face for the first time. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Its features were twisted, a grotesque blend of animal and man, with a snout-like nose and eyes that glinted in the dim light. Its mouth was smeared with blood, sharp teeth bared in a snarl. I took a step back, trying to keep quiet, but my boot landed on a dry twig, snapping it with a loud crack. The sound echoed through the forest, and the creature's head snapped in my direction, its eyes locking onto mine. For a split second, everything was silent. Then it let out a low, rumbling growl, its body shifting as it rose to its full height. It was even bigger than I'd thought, towering over me, its muscles rippling beneath the fur. My blood turned to ice. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. I just ran. The sound of heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush told me the thing was right behind me, closing the distance fast. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I couldn't stop. Not now, not with that thing chasing me. The trees whipped past me in a blur as I sprinted through the forest, dodging branches and leaping over fallen logs. I could hear the creature's growls, feel the ground shake beneath its weight. It was faster than I expected, faster than something that size should have been. My only thought was to get back to the camp, to the relative safety of the clearing. I could hear my radio crackling, Mike's voice cutting through the static, but I couldn't make out the words. I was too focused on the sound of the creature closing in on me. I burst into the clearing, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear the thing crashing through the trees behind me, but I didn't stop. I ran for the far side of the clearing, where the trail would take me back toward the station. Maybe if I could make it there, I'd stand a chance. But the footsteps behind me stopped. I slowed, then turned, expecting to see the creature lunging at me. But it wasn't there. The clearing was empty, save for the wrecked tents and scattered gear. I stood there, chest heaving, trying to catch my breath. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had it given up? Was it waiting in the shadows, watching me? The silence was deafening. No wind, No birds. Just the sound of my ragged breathing and the distant crackle of my radio. Then I saw it, the creature, standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the trees. Its eyes glinted in the fading light, watching me with an intensity that sent a fresh wave of terror through me. It didn't move, didn't growl. It just stood there, staring. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the creature. My heart pounded so hard I could barely hear the crackling of the radio in my hand. "Charlie, you there? What's going on?" I fumbled with the radio, my hands shaking. "Mike, I don't know what this thing is, but it's—" Before I could finish, the creature stepped back into the shadows, disappearing into the forest without a sound. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly I made my way back to the wrecked campsite, my legs trembling with every step. Backup would arrive soon, but I wasn't sure it would matter. Whatever had happened here, whatever that thing was, it was still out there, and I had a feeling it wasn't done. Story 6. I've always loved the solitude of hiking alone. The peace, the quiet, the chance to clear my head and reconnect with nature. But after what happened in those caves, I don't think I'll ever hike solo again. Some things you're just not meant to face alone. My name is Emily, and I'm an experienced hiker and amateur spelunker. I've explored caves all over the country, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in the Appalachian wilderness last fall. It was supposed to be a simple day hike, a chance to scout out some new trails before the winter set in. The weather was perfect, crisp and clear, with just a hint of autumn in the air. I set out early, my backpack loaded with supplies, a spring in my step and a song in my heart. The trail was challenging but beautiful, winding through dense forests and along steep ridgelines. By midday, I'd left the marked paths behind, using my GPS and topographical maps to navigate the untamed wilderness. That's when I saw it, a dark opening in the side of a hill, partially hidden by undergrowth. It wasn't on any of my maps, and excitement surged through me. An unexplored cave system, right here in my backyard. It was too good to pass up. I approached cautiously, shining my headlamp into the darkness. The entrance was narrow but passable, and cool air flowed out, carrying the musty scent of underground spaces. After leaving a note with my planned route in my car, a precaution I always take, I felt confident in taking a quick look. Just a few minutes, I told myself, as I squeezed through the entrance, just to see how far it goes. The passageway widened almost immediately, opening into a large chamber with a ceiling so high my light couldn't reach it. Stalactites hung like stone icicles, water dripping steadily from their tips. The sound echoed in the vast space, creating an eerie, rhythmic backdrop. I moved deeper into the cave, marveling at the rock formations. This place was a geological wonder, and I couldn't believe it hadn't been documented. As I rounded a bend, my light fell on something that made me catch my breath. A set of scratch marks on the wall. 3 parallel lines carved deep into the stone. Udbear marks, I told myself, trying to calm my suddenly racing heart. Probably an old den. But as I examined them closer, doubt crept in. They were too high up the wall for a bear, unless it had been standing on its hind legs. And the spacing was all wrong, too wide for a bear's paw, almost as if made by a giant human hand. I shook off the unsettling thoughts and pressed on. The passage narrowed and twisted, leading ever deeper into the earth. I lost track of time as I explored, taking photos and mental notes for the report I'd write later. That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very rock around me. I froze, my light darting around the passage. "Hello!" I called out, immediately regretting it as my voice echoed back at me, along with something else, a shuffling sound, like something large moving in the darkness beyond my light's reach. Panic seized me and I turned to retrace my steps, but in my haste I must have taken a wrong turn. The passages all looked the same in the beam of my headlamp, and soon I realized with growing horror that I was lost. I tried to stay calm, to think rationally. I had supplies, water, and light. Someone would come looking for me eventually. All I had to do was stay put and wait for rescue. But as the hours ticked by, marked only by the steady drip of water, my resolve began to crumble. The darkness pressed in around me, and every shadow seemed to hide some lurking threat. The growls came more frequently now, sometimes distant, sometimes so close I could feel the vibrations in my chest. My headlamp began to flicker, the battery running low. I switched to my backup light, but knew it wouldn't last forever. As the darkness closed in, my mind began to play tricks on me. I saw shapes moving in the shadows, heard whispers in the echoes of dripping water. In my panicked state, I almost missed it. A faint draft of fresh air, coming from a narrow crack in the wall. Hope surged through me. Where there was air, there had to be a way out. I squeezed through the opening, scraping my arms and legs on the rough stone. The passage beyond was tight, forcing me to crawl on my hands and knees, but the air was definitely fresher here, spurring me on. As I rounded a bend, my light fell on something that made my blood run cold. There, pressed into the soft mud of the cave floor, was a footprint, but not like any I'd ever seen before. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own foot, with long, claw-like toes, and it was fresh. I scrambled backward, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. That's when I heard it, a wet, snuffling sound like something scenting the air, and then a roar that shook loose stones from the ceiling. I ran. I didn't care about direction anymore, didn't care about getting more lost. All that mattered was putting distance between me and whatever had made that sound. I don't know how long I ran, squeezing through tight passages, splashing through underground streams. My light bounced wildly off the walls, creating a nightmarish kaleidoscope of shadows and reflections. I burst into a large chamber and skidded to a stop. There, on the far wall, was a shaft of daylight, an exit, safety. I almost cried with relief, but between me and freedom stood the owner of those footprints. In the dim light, I could make out a massive, shaggy form. It was vaguely humanoid, but much too large, with long arms that hung below its knees. And its eyes, God, its eyes. They glowed in the darkness, filled with an intelligence that was decidedly not animal. For a long moment, we stared at each other. I was frozen in terror, unable to move, barely able to breathe. The creature cocked its head, as if puzzled by my presence. Then it took a step forward, and the spell was broken. I bolted for the exit, expecting at any moment to feel claws tearing into my back, but nothing came. I reached the opening and squeezed through. Tumbling out onto a forested slope, I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing in a small clearing. As I lay there, gasping for air, I realized the sun was setting. I'd been in those caves for nearly a full day. It took me hours to find my way back to my car, guided by the GPS on my phone, which had miraculously maintained enough charge. As I drove home, I tried to make sense of what had happened, what I'd seen. But every explanation fell short. I reported my experience to the park rangers, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They promised to investigate, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. Whatever lived in those caves didn't want to be found. It's been months since that day, and I still have nightmares about those glowing eyes in the darkness. I've researched cryptids, tried to find any reports of similar creatures in the area, but nothing quite matches what I saw. I haven't been hiking since then. The woods that once brought me peace now feel threatening, full of shadows and hidden dangers. I know rationally that I should be able to dismiss what happened as a hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion. But I can't shake the feeling that I glimpsed something that day, something that wasn't meant for human eyes. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself staring out my window at the distant mountains, and I wonder, is it still out there, lurking in the darkness beneath the earth? And what would happen if it ever decided to come out into the light? I don't think I'll ever know for sure, but one thing's certain. I'll never look at a cave the same way again, because now I know that sometimes the monsters hiding in the dark are all too real. Story 7. The silence hit me first. The woods around my cabin had always been full of life, rustling leaves, birds chirping, the distant sound of a creek flowing just beyond the trees. But today it was dead quiet. No wind, no birds, no animals, just nothing. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. I stood on the porch of my hunting cabin, staring out into the dense pines that stretched as far as the eye could see. Normally, this place brought me peace. It was my retreat, far away from the noise of the world, just me and the wilderness. But today, it felt different, wrong, even. I'd been out hunting all morning and hadn't seen a single deer, rabbit, or even a damn squirrel. It wasn't normal. It's mid-fall, the time of year when the forest is bustling with life. But today, it felt like I was the only living thing out here. I sighed, tightening my grip on my rifle. Maybe I'd have better luck in the afternoon, but as I stood there, scanning the tree line, a strange sensation crawled over me. It was subtle at first, like the hair on the back of my neck standing up, but then it grew, the feeling of being watched. I turned slowly, scanning the woods, but saw nothing. Just the same, endless trees swaying slightly in the breeze. Then I heard it. A branch snapping somewhere deep in the forest. It wasn't the usual crack of a twig under a deer's hoof or the rustle of an animal moving through the underbrush. This was something else, louder, heavier, like something big was moving out there. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. I wasn't one to get spooked easily. I'd spent my entire life in the wilderness, but there was something about that sound, the way it echoed through the trees, that sent a shiver down my spine. Probably just a bear, I muttered to myself, though I didn't quite believe it. I'd seen bears plenty of times before, and they never moved like this. This was different. I headed back inside the cabin, closing the door behind me with a soft click. The cabin was small, just one room with a wood stove, a bed, a table, and a few chairs. It wasn't much, but it was all I needed. I set my rifle down by the door, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling gnawing at my gut. The hours passed slowly. I made some coffee, checked over my gear, and tried to relax. But that silence, the kind that seemed to press in from all sides, never went away. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see something moving out there, but the forest remained still. Around mid-afternoon, I decided I couldn't sit around any longer. Whatever it was, I'd figure it out. It was probably just my imagination running wild anyway. I grabbed my rifle, slung it over my shoulder, and stepped out onto the porch. The moment I did, I heard it again. Another snap. Closer this time. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. The sound came from just beyond the clearing in front of the cabin, where the trees were thickest. I squinted, trying to make out anything through the dense foliage, but there was nothing, just shadows and trees. I felt my throat tighten. I'd hunted all kinds of animals, but this didn't feel right. The air felt too thick, too charged with something I couldn't name. Taking a deep breath, I stepped off the porch and started walking toward the tree line. My boots crunched against the fallen leaves, and I winced at the sound. Every step I took felt too loud, like I was announcing my presence to whatever was out there. The forest swallowed me up quickly, the light dimming as the canopy closed overhead. The thick scent of pine and damp earth filled my nostrils, but even that didn't calm my nerves. I walked slowly, ears straining for any sound that might give me a clue as to what was out there. Then, just ahead of me, I saw it. At first I thought it was a shadow, a trick of the light as the sun dipped lower in the sky, but no, it was real. A figure, tall and hulking, standing motionless between the trees. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my ears. It was big, too big to be any animal I'd ever seen out here. It was standing upright, like a man, but it wasn't a man. I could see that much, even from this distance. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, and its arms hung at its sides, long and muscular. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there watching me. I raised my rifle instinctively, my hands shaking. "Hey!" I called out, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. No response. The figure shifted slightly, and I saw its eyes, glinting, almost yellow in the fading light. They were locked on me, cold and calculating, like a predator sizing up its prey. A wave of nausea rolled through me, my instincts screaming at me to get out of there. I took a step back, the rifle still aimed, but I knew deep down it wouldn't do much good. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't afraid of me. It was toying with me. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the thing turned and disappeared into the trees. Not running, but moving with a kind of fluid grace that didn't match its size. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. But there were no answers, just more questions. After a long moment, I lowered the rifle and turned back toward the cabin, my legs shaking. I didn't run, but I walked fast, too fast maybe, desperate to put distance between me and whatever the hell that thing was. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and darkness was creeping in fast. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it out of instinct, though I doubted it would do much good if that thing wanted to get in. I paced the cabin, my mind racing. What the hell was that? I'd heard stories, whispers from other hunters, legends about strange creatures in the woods, but I'd never believed them until now. The hours dragged by, and the unease never left. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside made my heart leap into my throat. I kept my rifle close, sitting at the edge of the bed, my eyes darting toward the window every few seconds. Then, just after midnight, I heard it again. A low, rumbling growl, barely audible but unmistakable, coming from just outside the cabin. My blood turned to ice. I stood up slowly, grabbing the rifle and moving toward the window. There, just beyond the tree line, I saw it. The same hulking figure standing at the edge of the clearing, watching the cabin. It was closer now, its eyes reflecting the faint moonlight, glowing in the dark like some kind of wild animal. It stood there, motionless, its breath misting in the cold air. The growl rumbled again, deep and guttural, vibrating through the air and into my bones. I raised the rifle, but my hands were trembling so badly I wasn't sure I could hit anything. Not that it would matter. The thing wasn't afraid of bullets. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, me from behind the safety of the cabin, and it from the shadows of the trees. I felt like prey, cornered and helpless, waiting for the inevitable. Then slowly it turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the night as silently as it had come. I didn't sleep that night, didn't even close my eyes. The next morning, I packed up and left. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. Who would believe me? But I knew I wasn't going back to that cabin, not ever again, because whatever that thing was, it was still out there, and it was watching. Story 8. I've been a forest ranger for over 2 decades, and I thought I'd seen it all. Bear attacks, lost hikers, even the occasional marijuana farm hidden deep in the woods. But nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for what I encountered during those fateful nights last October. It was something that shook my understanding of the natural world to its core and left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the creatures that inhabit our forests. My name is Tom, and this is the story of how I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist. It all started with a series of disappearances. At first, it was just a few campers who didn't check out on time. Not unusual in itself. People often extend their stays or forget to inform the ranger station, but then more reports started coming in. Hikers who never returned from day trips. Campsites found abandoned, tents shredded and belongings scattered. As the lead ranger in the area, it fell to me to investigate. I'd dealt with missing persons before, but something about this felt different. There was a pattern to the disappearances. all centered around a remote section of the park that we rarely patrolled due to its rough terrain. I set out on a crisp autumn morning, the trees a blaze of red and gold. The air was thick with the scent of pine and decaying leaves. As I hiked deeper into the backcountry, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest was too quiet. No birdsong, no scurrying of small animals. It was as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. By late afternoon, I reached the first of the abandoned campsites. What I saw made my blood run cold. The tent was in tatters, sleeping bags and backpacks strewn about as if something had rifled through them. But it was the tracks that caught my attention, huge, barefoot prints pressed deep into the soft earth. Whatever had made them was bipedal and massive, far larger than any bear I'd ever encountered. I radioed back to base, reporting what I'd found. They told me to continue my investigation, but to be cautious. Search and rescue teams would be deployed in the morning if I didn't return. As night fell, I made camp, choosing a defensible position with my back to a cliff face. Sleep didn't come easy. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me reaching for my rifle. It was well past midnight when I heard it, a long, mournful howl that echoed through the valley. It wasn't a wolf, wasn't any animal I recognized. The sound sent shivers down my spine and set my heart racing. I spent the rest of the night on high alert, my flashlight scanning the tree line. Several times I caught glimpses of eyes reflecting in the darkness. They were set too high off the ground to be a normal predator, and they moved with an unsettling intelligence. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. As soon as there was enough light to see, I broke camp and continued my search. I found 2 more destroyed campsites that day, each bearing the same massive footprints. By late afternoon, I had to face facts. I was dealing with something unknown, something potentially dangerous. That's when I saw it. At the edge of a clearing, partially hidden by the underbrush, was a figure. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. For a moment, our eyes met. I saw intelligence there, curiosity maybe, but also something wild and unpredictable. Then, with a speed that seemed impossible for its size, it vanished into the forest. I stood there, frozen, my mind struggling to process what I'd seen. It couldn't be real. There was no such thing as Bigfoot, no giant ape-men roaming the forests of North America, and yet I couldn't deny the evidence of my own eyes. As night fell again, I knew I had to make a decision. The smart thing would be to head back, to report what I'd seen and let a larger team handle the investigation, but something kept me there. A need to know, to understand what was happening in my forest. I set up camp again, this time rigging trail cameras around the perimeter. If that thing came back, I'd have proof. As darkness settled over the forest, the noises started again. Howls, whoops, and what sounded like wood knocking against wood. It was as if the creature was trying to communicate, to warn me off its territory. I didn't sleep at all that night. The sounds came closer and closer, until I could hear heavy breathing just beyond the reach of my firelight. I sat with my rifle across my knees, every muscle tense, waiting for an attack that never came. When dawn broke, I checked the cameras with shaking hands. Most of them showed nothing but darkness and trees, but one, the one pointing directly at my tent, had captured something extraordinary. A massive, hair-covered arm reaching into frame, long fingers curled around the trunk of a tree. The image was blurry, indistinct, but unmistakably not human. I packed up quickly, my mind racing. I had to get this evidence back, had to show people what was out here. But as I hiked back toward the ranger station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, or hear the crack of a branch breaking under a heavy foot. I was within sight of the station when I heard it, that same mournful howl, but this time tinged with something that sounded almost like sorrow. I turned and saw it standing at the edge of the forest. Our eyes met again, and in that moment I understood. This wasn't some mindless beast. It was intelligent, aware, and it was protecting its home. I made it back to the station and reported everything I'd seen. I showed them the footprint casts I'd made, the fur samples I'd collected, the blurry photos from the trail cam. They listened politely, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. Even with the evidence in front of them, it was too fantastic to believe. In the days that followed, search teams combed the area where I'd had my encounter. They found nothing, no tracks, no broken camps, no sign that anything unusual had ever been there. It was as if the forest had swallowed all traces of the creature's existence. The official report chalked the disappearances up to a rogue bear, possibly rabid. The campsites were said to have been destroyed by vandals. My photos and samples were dismissed as inconclusive. Life in the park returned to normal, but I know what I saw. I know what's out there, hiding in the deepest, darkest parts of the forest. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full, I hear that howl again, drifting on the wind. A reminder that there are still mysteries in this world, things that defy explanation. I still patrol those remote areas, though I'm more cautious now. And sometimes, when the light hits the trees just right, I catch a glimpse of something large moving through the underbrush. We've come to an understanding, the creature and I. I protect its secret, and in return, it allows me to share its forest. But I often wonder how many other rangers, hikers, and campers have seen what I've seen. How many have encountered something they can't explain, something that challenges everything they thought they knew about the natural world. One thing's for certain. I'll never look at the forest the same way again, because now I know that in the deepest, darkest parts of the wilderness, something is watching, something ancient, something intelligent, something that reminds us that we're not always at the top of the food chain. And as long as I'm a ranger in these woods, I'll do everything in my power to protect not just the humans who visit, but also the secrets that the forest keeps. Because some mysteries are better left unsolved, some creatures better left undiscovered. In the end, the forest will always keep its secrets, and maybe, just maybe, that's exactly how it should be. Story 9. The claw marks were the first sign that something was wrong. I'd been hiking for hours, deep into a section of the forest that hardly anyone visited. It wasn't marked on any official map, the Lost Trail, as the locals called it. I liked it that way. I was here for the solitude, to capture the wild beauty of nature through my camera lens. But as I stood there, staring at the thick, jagged lines carved into the bark of a towering pine, a chill ran down my spine. These marks weren't the usual scratches you'd expect from a bear or a passing animal. They were deep, almost too precise, and stretched high up the trunk, higher than any bear could reach. Whatever had made them was either bigger than I wanted to imagine or something else entirely. I swallowed hard, trying to push away the unease gnawing at my gut. I was alone, miles from the nearest trailhead, with nothing but my backpack, camera, and a hunting knife strapped to my belt. It had been a spontaneous decision, hiking out here alone, but I'd done it countless times before. This time, though, the forest felt different. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was just my imagination. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly alone out here. The forest, usually alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, felt unnaturally quiet. Every step I took, every crunch of leaves under my boots, felt too loud, like I was disturbing something that didn't want to be found. I raised my camera, focusing on the claw marks. The lens clicked as I captured the image, but even as I lowered the camera, my skin prickled with that creeping sense of unease. I glanced around, scanning the dense trees and shadows that seemed to move with every gust of wind. The trail ahead curved deeper into the forest, leading toward a ridge I hadn't explored before. My plan had been to reach the ridge, snap some photos of the valley below, and camp for the night. But now, standing there with those claw marks fresh in my mind, I wasn't sure if I wanted to keep going. Then I heard it. A soft, distant whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, weaving its way through the trees, but as I stood there, straining to listen, the sound grew clearer. It wasn't the wind, it was voices, faint, indistinct, like someone or something was speaking just out of earshot. My heart started to pound. I wasn't sure why, but something about those whispers felt wrong. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was unsettling, like a murmur shared between two people who didn't want to be overheard. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing, no one, just the same endless stretch of forest, thick with trees and underbrush. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky, cracking the heavy silence around me. It echoed back at me, swallowed by the forest without a reply. I waited, holding my breath, but the whispers stopped as soon as I spoke. The silence that followed was even worse. It pressed in around me, heavy and thick, like the forest itself was watching, waiting. I took a step forward, deciding to keep moving. Maybe it was the isolation getting to me, or maybe I was overreacting, but every instinct I had was screaming at me to keep walking, to put distance between me and whatever had carved those marks or made those sounds. The trail grew narrower, more overgrown as I continued, my eyes darting to the shadows that seemed to shift and dance in the corners of my vision. The whispers didn't return, but that feeling, that gut-deep certainty that I wasn't alone, never left me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, something, following me, but there was nothing, not even a breeze. The light was fading faster than I'd expected. The sun, hidden behind a thick wall of clouds, barely reached the forest floor. The trees loomed overhead, their branches tangling together, casting strange, twisted shadows on the ground. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I froze. Ahead of me, in the middle of the path, lay something I hadn't noticed before. It was a pile of stones, small, neatly stacked, like a cairn. But there was something off about it. It didn't look like a natural marker. It looked deliberate, like it had been placed there by someone. I stepped closer, my skin crawling. The stones were covered in a thin layer of moss, but they couldn't have been there long. The placement was too fresh, too precise. I crouched down, staring at the pile, my mind racing. Who would have built this out here, on a trail that no one used? Suddenly, the whispers started again, louder this time, more insistent. I whipped my head around, heart pounding in my chest. Nothing, just the forest, just the trees. But the sound was real. I could hear it, the faint murmur of voices threading through the trees. Closer now. My breath hitched as I stood, my hand instinctively reaching for the knife at my belt. I didn't pull it out, but the weight of it in my grip gave me some small comfort. I scanned the woods again, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then I saw it, a shape, just a flicker of movement in the shadows, between the trees. It was there 1 second, gone the next, too fast for me to get a good look, but it was big. Larger than any animal I'd expect to find out here, and it moved with a kind of unnatural grace, silent and swift. I took a step back, my mouth dry. The forest around me felt suffocating, the air thick with tension. I wanted to run, to turn around and bolt down the trail the way I came. But something kept me rooted in place. Fear, curiosity, I don't know what, but I couldn't leave. Not yet. I stood there, waiting, listening. The whispers had stopped again, but the feeling, the presence, hadn't. I knew something was out there, watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned, my boots crunching on the leaves as I started to walk, faster this time, my eyes darting from tree to tree. I needed to get out of this forest, back to the safety of the trailhead. The lost trail was no longer a place for peace and solitude. It felt like a trap. The light was fading fast now, the shadows growing long and dark around me. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through my body. My mind raced with thoughts of what might be following me, lurking just out of sight. Then ahead of me on the trail, something caught my eye. Another cairn, identical to the first, sitting in the middle of the path. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't passed this before. I was sure of it. This one was new. I backed away, my pulse thundering in my ears. The whispers started up again, louder than ever, swirling around me, filling my head with a disorienting hum. I spun around, knife in hand now, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. There, just beyond the cairn, I saw it again, a tall, dark figure, half hidden in the shadows, watching, waiting. My breath caught in my throat. It was bigger than before, more defined now, like it had grown bolder as the light faded. Its eyes, reflective, like an animal's, glinted through the darkness, locked onto me. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I ran. I sprinted down the trail, branches whipping at my face, the whispers rising to a deafening roar in my ears. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees twisting and bending as I stumbled blindly forward. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Behind me I could hear it, footsteps heavy and fast, closing the distance. The whispers were no longer just voices. They were a part of me now, filling my mind with a sickening dread. I burst through the trees, the trailhead finally coming into view. My car was parked just beyond it, and I didn't slow until I reached it, throwing myself inside and slamming the door behind me. The whispers stopped. The forest, once again, was silent. But as I sat there, chest heaving, hands trembling, I knew that I had escaped something ancient, something that had been waiting in those woods, watching for longer than I could comprehend. And I knew that I would never go back to the lost trail again. Story 10. I've always loved solo camping, the solitude, the connection with nature, the chance to test my mettle against the elements. But after that night in the Ozarks, I don't think I'll ever sleep alone in the woods again. Some things you're just not prepared to face on your own. My name is Lisa, and this is the story of the night a storm trapped me with something that shouldn't exist. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip, a chance to clear my head and reset after a brutal month at work. The weather forecast promised clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect camping conditions. I packed light, just my tent, sleeping bag, and enough supplies for a couple of days off the grid. The hike-in was beautiful. The Ozark forests were a riot of autumn colors, the air crisp and clean. By late afternoon, I'd found the perfect spot to set up camp, a small clearing near a babbling brook, far from any marked trails. As I pitched my tent, I reveled in the silence, broken only by bird song and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I should have known it was too good to last. The storm blew in just as I was finishing dinner. One minute, the sky was clear. The next, dark clouds rolled in, bringing with them a wind that howled through the trees like a living thing. I barely had time to secure my gear before the rain hit, coming down in sheets so thick I could barely see the trees at the edge of my campsite. Lightning flashed, illuminating the forest in stark, terrifying clarity. In those brief moments of brightness, the familiar shapes of trees and rocks transformed into looming monsters, reaching out with gnarled limbs. I dove into my tent, zipping it up tight against the deluge. The thin fabric walls shuddered under the assault of wind and rain. I curled up in my sleeping bag, trying to convince myself that I was safe, that it was just a storm, that it would pass. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But as I listened, straining my ears over the pounding rain, I realized it was something else, something alive. Scritch, Scritch, scritch. The sound of claws on bark, too rhythmic to be branches in the wind. My heart began to race. I fumbled for my flashlight, hands shaking. Part of me didn't want to look, didn't want to know what was out there, but I had to see. I unzipped the tent flap, just a crack, and pointed my light into the darkness. For a moment, all I saw was rain and the shadowy shapes of trees. Then a flash of lightning illuminated the clearing, and I saw it. A massive, hulking shape stood at the edge of my campsite. It was vaguely humanoid, but far too large, its body covered in thick, matted fur. In the brief moment of light, I caught a glimpse of a face that was not quite human, not quite animal, with eyes that reflected my flashlight beam like a cat's. I stifled a scream and quickly zipped the tent back up, my mind reeling. It couldn't be real. There was no such thing as monsters, no giant ape-men roaming the Ozark forests. I must have imagined it, a trick of the light and my overstimulated imagination. But then came the sounds. Heavy footsteps circling my tent, snuffling noises, like something scenting the air, and then a low, rumbling growl that I felt more than heard, vibrating through the ground beneath me. I huddled in my sleeping bag, barely daring to breathe. My cell phone lay useless beside me, no signal this far into the backcountry. I was alone, trapped in a paper-thin shelter with something impossible prowling just outside. The storm raged on, but now it felt like the least of my worries. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent a fresh jolt of terror through me. I kept expecting the tent to be ripped open at any moment, to find myself face to face with whatever was out there. Hours passed like this, in a state of hypervigilance that left me exhausted, but unable to sleep. As the storm began to die down, the sounds outside changed. The footsteps moved away. The growls faded, but I didn't dare hope it was over. Just as I was starting to think I might have imagined the whole thing, I heard a new sound. A long, mournful howl that started low and rose to a pitch that sent shivers down my spine. It was answered by another howl, further away, then another. There was more than one of them out there. I must have dozed off at some point, despite my terror. When I opened my eyes, watery sunlight was filtering through the tent walls. The storm had passed. For a long moment, I just lay there, listening. The forest had come alive with the normal sounds of morning, birdsong, squirrels chattering, the wind in the leaves. No growls, no footsteps, no howls. Slowly, cautiously, I unzipped the tent and peeked out. The clearing was a mess, debris scattered everywhere by the storm, but there was something else, something that made my blood run cold. Footprints, huge, unmistakably bipedal footprints pressed deep into the mud around my tent. They were fresh, the edges still sharp and clear. Whatever had made them was no bear, no known animal. And they came right up to my tent. So close I could have reached out and touched them from where I'd slept. I broke camp in record time, my hands shaking so badly I could barely roll up my sleeping bag. Every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow made me jump. I kept expecting to see that hulking shape again, watching me from the trees. The hike back to my car was a blur of paranoia and adrenaline. I felt eyes on me the whole way. Heard twigs snapping and leaves rustling just out of sight. When I finally reached the parking lot, I nearly cried with relief. I reported what I'd seen to the park rangers, showing them the photos I'd taken of the footprints. They listened politely, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They promised to investigate, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. Whatever had been out there, it didn't want to be found. It's been months since that night, and I still have nightmares about those glowing eyes in the darkness, about that howl that seemed to come from something not quite animal, not quite human. I've researched cryptids, read every Bigfoot sighting report I could find, but nothing quite matches what I experienced. I haven't been camping since then. The woods that once brought me peace now feel threatening, full of shadows and hidden dangers. I know, rationally, that I should be able to dismiss what happened as a hallucination brought on by fear and the storm. but I can't shake the feeling that I glimpsed something that night, something that wasn't meant for human eyes. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I think I can hear that howl again, drifting on the breeze. A reminder that there are still mysteries in this world, things that defy explanation and challenge our understanding of what's real. I don't know if I'll ever go back to those woods. Part of me wants to prove to myself that it was all in my head, but a bigger part knows better, because now I understand that sometimes the monsters hiding in the dark are all too real, and once you've seen them, you can never unsee them. So if you're ever camping in the Ozarks and you hear something moving in the night that doesn't sound quite right, don't dismiss it. Don't try to convince yourself it's just the wind or your imagination, because it might not be. And by the time you realize that, it might be too late. Story 11. I've spent my entire career capturing the beauty and brutality of nature through my camera lens. I've photographed charging rhinos in Africa, stalked tigers in India, and even had a few close calls with grizzlies in Alaska. But nothing in my 20 years as a wildlife photographer could have prepared me for what I encountered that night in the Pacific Northwest. It was an experience that shattered my understanding of the natural world and left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the creatures that inhabit our forests. My name is Mark, and this is the story of the night I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist. It was supposed to be a routine assignment, a week in the Cascade Mountains, documenting the return of wolves to the area. I'd spent the first few days tracking paw prints and setting up camera traps, catching fleeting glimpses of the elusive predators. But it was on the fourth night that everything changed. I'd set up in an old firewatch tower, planning to use the elevated position to scan the valley below for wolf activity. The tower creaked and swayed in the wind, but I'd worked in worse conditions. As the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, I settled in for a long night of observation. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I caught sight of a few deer, an owl, even a fox slinking through the underbrush, but no wolves. As midnight approached, I was beginning to think about calling it a night when I saw something that made me do a double take. At first, I thought it was a bear, a large, dark shape moving between the trees at the edge of a clearing. But as I focused my long-range lens on it, I realized this was no bear. It was walking upright, on two legs, with a gait that was unsettlingly human-like. My heart began to race. I'd heard the Bigfoot stories, of course. You can't work in these forests without hearing them, but I'd always dismissed them as folklore, tall tales told around campfires. Yet here I was, looking at something that defied explanation. I started snapping photos frantically, my camera's shutter a rapid-fire click in the silence of the night. The creature moved with a fluid grace that belied its massive size. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. As it moved into a patch of moonlight, I caught a glimpse of its face, a blend of ape and human features that sent a chill down my spine. Suddenly, it stopped. Its head swiveled, looking directly at the tower. At me. Even from this distance, I could see the intelligence in its eyes. It knew it was being watched. For a long moment, we stared at each other. My finger hovered over the shutter button, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Then, with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large, it vanished into the forest. I sat there, stunned, my mind struggling to process what I'd just seen. It couldn't be real. It had to be a hoax, a man in a suit. But deep down, I knew no costume could move like that, could convey that sense of ancient, primal intelligence. Eager to review my photos, I reached for my camera. But when I tried to access the memory card, nothing happened. The screen was blank, the card unreadable. Frantically, I tried my backup camera, the one I'd set up to take time-lapse shots of the valley. It too was dead, its memory card fried, A cold dread settled over me. Whatever that creature was, it had somehow affected my equipment, all my evidence gone in an instant. As I sat there trying to make sense of what had happened, I heard it. A low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite speech, but something in between, and it was getting closer. The tower began to shake, more violently than any wind could cause. I heard the creak of wood under immense pressure, the pop of nails being wrenched free. Something was climbing the tower. Panic seized me. I scrambled for my gear, shoving cameras and lenses into my bag without care. The hatch leading down from the tower was on the other side of the room, past the windows that now showed only darkness and the vague impression of something massive moving outside. I made a break for it, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. As I reached for the hatch, a huge, hairy arm smashed through the window, showering me with broken glass. The hand at the end of that arm was terrifyingly human-like, but larger than any human hand had a right to be, tipped with claws that could easily tear me apart. I wrenched open the hatch and practically fell down the ladder, my gear clattering behind me. The whole tower groaned and swayed, timbers snapping under the assault of the creature trying to get in. I hit the ground running, not daring to look back. The forest that had seemed so peaceful during the day was now a dark maze of grasping branches and hidden roots. I stumbled and fell, got up, ran again. All the while I could hear it behind me, the crash of underbrush, the splintering of trees shoved aside by something incredibly strong. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, my lungs burning, my legs threatening to give out at any moment. But finally, mercifully, I saw lights ahead. The ranger station at the trailhead. I burst into the station, wild-eyed and gasping for breath. The startled ranger on duty leapt to his feet, reaching for his radio. As I tried to explain what had happened, what I'd seen, I realized how crazy it all sounded. A giant, ape-like creature that could disable electronics and climb an 80-foot tower like it was nothing. The ranger listened patiently, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He suggested that perhaps I'd fallen asleep in the tower, that it had all been a vivid nightmare brought on by exhaustion. Part of me wanted to believe him, to dismiss the whole experience as a bad dream, but I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard, what I'd felt. In the days that followed, search teams combed the area around the tower. They found nothing, no footprints, no fur, no sign that anything unusual had ever been there. The tower itself showed some damage, but it was attributed to wind and general decay. My cameras were examined by experts who concluded that a power surge had fried the electronics. A freak occurrence, they said, but not unheard of. I tried to put the experience behind me, to focus on my work, but I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes. That sense of being in the presence of something ancient and intelligent, something that didn't want to be discovered. I've been back to those mountains many times since that night. I tell myself it's for work, but deep down, I know I'm looking for it, for proof. Sometimes, when the light hits the trees just right, I think I see a shape moving in the shadows. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I think I hear that low, rumbling, not quite growl. But I've never seen it again. Never captured it on film, and part of me is glad, because now I understand that there are some things in this world that aren't meant to be seen, some mysteries that aren't meant to be solved. I still take pictures of wolves, of bears, of all the known predators that roam our forests. But now, when I look through my lens at the deep shadows between the trees, I know there's something else out there, something watching, something waiting, and I wonder how many other photographers, hikers, rangers have seen what I've seen, how many have encountered something they can't explain, something that challenges everything they thought they knew about the natural world. One thing's for certain, I'll never look at the forest the same way again, because now I know that in the deepest, darkest parts of the wilderness, something is watching. Something that reminds us that we're not always the ones behind the lens, not always the observers. Sometimes we're the ones being observed. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly how it should be. Story 12. I've always considered myself an experienced hiker. I've tackled some of the toughest trails across the country, always with my daughter by my side. But nothing could have prepared us for what we encountered in the Appalachian wilderness last fall. It was a night that turned our love for nature into a primal fear of what lurks in the shadows. My name is Karen, and this is the story of how a simple mother-daughter hike became a terrifying fight for survival. It was supposed to be a celebration. My daughter, Emily, had just turned 16, and I wanted to mark the occasion with a special trip. Just the two of us tackling a challenging section of the Appalachian Trail. We'd been planning it for months, poring over maps, upgrading our gear, and training on local trails. The first 2 days were everything we'd hoped for. The autumn colors were at their peak, painting the mountains in brilliant reds and golds. We laughed, talked, and enjoyed the kind of connection that only comes from shared adventure. But on the third day, everything changed. It started with a wrong turn. We'd stopped for lunch at a beautiful overlook, and in our excitement to get back on the trail, we must have missed a marker. It wasn't until late afternoon that we realized our mistake. The trail had become increasingly overgrown, nothing like the well-maintained path we'd been following. "Mom, I think we're lost," Emily said, her voice tinged with worry. I tried to hide my own concern, pulling out our map and compass. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, I had to admit the truth. We were well off our planned route, in a part of the forest I didn't recognize. "It's okay, honey," I assured her, trying to keep my voice steady. "We'll find a safe spot to camp for the night and get our bearings in the morning." But as darkness fell, an uneasy feeling settled over us. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming during the day, now felt oppressive. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying sounds that made us jump, cracks and rustles that seemed too deliberate to be just animals. We found a small clearing and quickly set up our tent. As we huddled inside, I could feel Emily trembling beside me. "Mom, did you hear that?" she whispered. I was about to reassure her when I heard it too. A loud crack, like a branch breaking under a heavy weight. It was close, too close. "Probably just a deer," I said, but I didn't believe it. The sound had come from too high up, like something walking on two legs. We held our breath, listening. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then we heard it, heavy footsteps, circling our campsite. Emily clutched my arm. "Mom, what is that?" I wished I had an answer for her. Whatever was out there, it was big, much bigger than a deer or even a bear, and the way it moved, it was almost methodical, as if it were studying us. Suddenly, a beam of moonlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the clearing, and that's when we saw it, a massive, shadowy figure at the edge of the trees. It was vaguely humanoid, but far too tall and broad to be a person. In the dim light, I could make out matted fur covering its body and long arms that hung below its knees. Emily stifled a scream, burying her face in my shoulder. I wanted to run, to grab our things and make a break for it, but some instinct told me that any sudden movement would be a mistake. The creature stood there, watching us. I could feel its gaze, sense an intelligence behind those eyes that reflected the moonlight like a cat's. For what felt like hours, we remained frozen in a silent standoff. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, melting back into the shadows with a speed and silence that seemed impossible for something so large. We didn't sleep that night. How could we? Every sound, every shadow became a potential threat. We huddled together in the tent, jumping at every snapped twig and rustle of leaves. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, we made a decision. We had to get out of there, had to find our way back to civilization. We packed up camp in record time, our hands shaking as we stuffed gear into our backpacks. But as we prepared to leave, Emily gasped. There, pressed into the soft earth around our tent, were footprints. Huge, humanoid prints that dwarfed our own. And they came right up to the tent wall, so close we could have reached out and touched whatever had made them. "Mom, what made these?" Emily's voice quavered. I shook my head, unable to form words. There was no animal I knew of that could have left prints like that. Nothing that should exist in these woods, or anywhere else for that matter. We set off at a brisk pace, trying to retrace our steps from the day before. But the forest seemed different in the morning light, unfamiliar and threatening. Every shadow held potential danger, every sound sent our hearts racing. As we hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Occasionally, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, or hear something large moving through the underbrush parallel to our path. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. Emily saw it too. "Mum, I think it's following us," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I wanted to tell her she was imagining things, that we were safe. But I couldn't bring myself to lie. Whatever we'd encountered last night, I was certain it wasn't done with us yet. As the day wore on, our situation became increasingly desperate. Our water was running low, and despite our best efforts, we seemed no closer to finding a marked trail. The terrain became rougher, forcing us to scramble over rocky outcroppings and through dense thickets. It was late afternoon when we heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Emily froze, her face pale with terror. "Run," I said, grabbing her hand, and we did. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. Behind us, I could hear something large giving chase, moving with a speed that shouldn't have been possible through such dense forest. Just when I thought our lungs would burst, we burst out of the tree line and onto a rocky ledge. Below us, the forest stretched out as far as the eye could see, but there, in the distance, was a plume of smoke. A campfire. People. "There!" I gasped, pointing. "We just need to—" My words were cut off by a roar that shook the very ground beneath our feet. We turned, and there it was, the creature from last night, standing at the edge of the clearing. In the daylight, I could see it clearly for the first time, and the sight stole the breath from my lungs. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with a body covered in thick, matted fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of ape and human features, with deep-set eyes that held an unmistakable intelligence. As it watched us, lips pulled back in a snarl to reveal sharp, yellowed teeth. Emily whimpered beside me, and I pushed her behind me, placing myself between her and the creature. For a long moment, we stood there, locked in a silent confrontation. I could feel its hot breath, smell the musky odor of its fur. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew we'd never outpace it. Then, to my utter shock, the creature's expression changed. The snarl faded, replaced by something almost curious. It cocked its head, studying us with those 2 intelligent eyes. Slowly, deliberately, it took a step back. I didn't waste the opportunity. Grabbing Emily's hand, I began to edge along the ledge, never taking my eyes off the creature. It watched us go, making no move to follow. As we reached the tree line on the other side of the clearing, I chanced a final look back. The creature was gone, vanished as silently as it had appeared. We made it to the campsite we'd seen, collapsing in exhaustion and babbling our story to the startled hikers we found there. They called in a rescue team, and by nightfall we were safe in a ranger station, being checked over by paramedics. Of course, no one believed our story about the creature. They attributed our experience to dehydration, exhaustion, and the stress of being lost. The rangers found no sign of anything unusual in the area where we'd been, but Emily and I know what we saw, what we experienced. It's been months since that day, and we still have nightmares about those eyes, that primordial roar. We haven't been hiking since then. The woods that once brought us so much joy now feel threatening, full of shadows and hidden dangers. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I think I can hear that growl again, drifting on the breeze. A reminder that there are still mysteries in this world, things that defy explanation and challenge our understanding of what's real. I don't know if we'll ever go back to those mountains. Part of me wants to prove to myself that it was all in our heads, but a bigger part knows better, because now we understand that sometimes the monsters hiding in the dark are all too real, and once you've seen them, you can never unsee them. So if you're ever hiking in the Appalachians and you feel eyes watching you from the shadows, don't dismiss it. Don't try to convince yourself it's just your imagination, because it might not be. And by the time you realize that, it might be too late. Story 13. I've spent my entire career studying the unknown, chasing myths and legends across the globe, but nothing in my years as a cryptozoologist could have prepared me for what I encountered in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. It was a discovery that shook the foundations of everything I thought I knew about nature and evolution. A night that left me questioning not just my research, but my very sanity. My name is Dr. David Larson, and this is the story of the night I came face to face with a creature that shouldn't exist. It all started with a series of unusual reports from hikers and campers in a remote area of the Cascade Mountains. Stories of strange howls in the night, massive footprints found in isolated clearings, and fleeting glimpses of something large moving through the trees. As a scientist specializing in undiscovered species, I'd heard similar tales before. But there was something different about these accounts, a consistency, a level of detail that piqued my interest. I assembled a small team and set out to investigate. We spent weeks in the forest, setting up camera traps, collecting hair and scat samples, and interviewing locals. At first, we found nothing concrete, just more stories and a few blurry photos that could have been anything. But then, on our final night in the field, everything changed. I was doing a solo night survey, checking our most remote camera stations. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels oppressive, as if the very air is holding its breath. As I approached our final camera, my headlamp caught something that made me stop in my tracks. There, in the soft earth, was a footprint. But not just any footprint. It was enormous, easily twice the size of my own boot, with 5 distinct toe impressions, and it was fresh. My heart began to race. In all my years of research, I'd never seen anything like it. I quickly set up my equipment, a night vision camera, audio recorder, and thermal imager. If whatever made that print was still in the area, I was determined to document it. Hours passed. The night grew colder, and a light mist began to fall, giving the forest an otherworldly quality. I was just beginning to think about packing up when I heard it, a low, rumbling vocalization that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a wolf, wasn't any animal I'd ever encountered. I scrambled to adjust my equipment, hands shaking with a mixture of excitement and fear, and that's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the mist and shadows, stood a figure. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, with a body covered in thick, dark fur. For a moment, I thought I was looking at a bear standing on its hind legs, but as it moved, I realized with a jolt of shock that this creature was bipedal. It stepped into the clearing, moving with a fluid grace that belied its size. In the green glow of my night vision camera, I could make out its features, a blend of ape and human characteristics that defied classification. Its face was flatter than a gorilla's, with a pronounced brow and deep-set eyes that reflected the infrared light like a cat's. I stood frozen, unable to move, barely daring to breathe. Part of me wanted to run, to get as far away from this impossible creature as I could. But the scientist in me kept me rooted to the spot, documenting every detail. The creature tilted its head, regarding me with an intelligence that sent chills down my spine. It was studying me just as intently as I was studying it. Slowly, carefully, I reached for my sample kit. If I could just get a hair sample, some physical evidence of this encounter. That's when things went wrong. As I moved, the creature's demeanor changed. Its lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing teeth that were decidedly omnivorous, a mix of sharp canines and flat molars. It let out a roar that shook the very ground beneath my feet. I stumbled backward, my equipment clattering to the forest floor. The creature advanced, its massive form blotting out the sky. In that moment, I was certain I was about to die, to become another mysterious disappearance in these woods. But then, something strange happened. As it reached me, the creature stopped. It leaned in close, so close I could feel its hot breath on my face, smell the musky odor of its fur. For a long moment, we stared at each other, neither moving. I saw something in its eyes then, something that shook me to my core. It wasn't just animal intelligence I was seeing. There was something more, something almost human. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. It turned and loped off into the forest, moving with a speed and silence that seemed impossible for something so large. I stood there, my heart pounding, trying to process what had just happened. It took several minutes before I remembered my equipment. I rushed to check the cameras, the audio recorders, desperate for some evidence of what I'd seen. But my heart sank as I reviewed the footage. The cameras had malfunctioned, producing nothing but static and blurred images. The audio recorders had picked up only white noise. Whatever this creature was, it seemed to have some effect on electronic equipment. I spent the rest of the night in a daze, alternating between excitement at what I'd discovered and fear that it would find me again. When dawn finally broke, I hiked back to our base camp, my mind racing with questions. I told my team what had happened, showed them the footprint I'd found. They were skeptical, of course. Without hard evidence, it was just another fantastic story in a field already full of them. We spent the next week combing the area, searching for any trace of the creature, but we found nothing. No more footprints, no hair samples, nothing that could conclusively prove what I'd seen. As we packed up to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. More than once, I caught glimpses of something large moving in the shadows, heard that distinctive vocalization in the distance, but it never showed itself again. Back in civilization, I threw myself into analyzing what little data we had. I wrote papers, gave lectures, reached out to colleagues in related fields, but without concrete evidence, my encounter was dismissed as a hallucination, a product of stress and isolation in the wilderness. Years have passed since that night, and I've never been able to prove what I saw. But I know what I experienced. I've spent my entire career studying unknown animals, and I know the difference between a bear or a known primate and what I encountered in those woods. I've been back to that forest many times since, hoping for another glimpse, another chance to document the creature's existence. Sometimes, when the light hits the trees just right, I think I see a large shape moving in the shadows. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I think I hear that distinctive call echoing through the valleys, but I've never seen it clearly again. And part of me is glad, because now I understand that there are some things in this world that aren't meant to be classified, some mysteries that aren't meant to be solved. I still study cryptids, still chase reports of unknown animals around the world. But now, when I look into the deep shadows of a forest or hear an unidentified sound in the wilderness, I approach with a newfound respect and caution, because I know that out there, in the unexplored corners of our world, there are creatures that defy our understanding of nature and evolution, and sometimes, just sometimes, they let themselves be seen. not to satisfy our scientific curiosity, but to remind us that the world is far more mysterious and wonderful than we can imagine. So if you're ever in the wilds of the Pacific Northwest, and you hear a sound you can't explain, or see a shadow that seems too large to be natural, don't dismiss it. Don't try to rationalize it away, because you might just be in the presence of something truly extraordinary, something that reminds us that we don't know everything about this world we call home, and maybe, just maybe, that's exactly how it should be. Story 14. I've always been drawn to the unexplained, the stories that lurk in the shadows of our world. As a documentary filmmaker, I've chased UFO sightings, explored haunted houses, and interviewed countless witnesses to the paranormal. But nothing in my career could have prepared me for what we encountered in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. It was an experience that blurred the line between legend and reality, and left us questioning everything we thought we knew about the natural world. My name is Alex, and this is the story of how our documentary about local folklore turned into a fight for survival against something that shouldn't exist. It started as a straightforward project. My team and I were producing a series on American folklore, focusing on the legends and mysteries unique to each region. Our trip to the Pacific Northwest was supposed to be about Bigfoot, interviewing locals, exploring alleged sighting locations, and maybe capturing some atmospheric footage of the misty forests. Our crew was small but experienced. There was me, the director, Sarah, our cinematographer, Mike, our sound guy, and Jess, our local guide and expert on Bigfoot lore. We'd spent a week gathering interviews in town, and now we were headed into the backcountry for some on-location shoots. The first few days were uneventful. We got some great scenery shots, did some dramatic recreations of famous sightings, and even found what Jess swore were Bigfoot tracks, though they looked like bear prints to me. It was all going according to plan. Then came the night that changed everything. We were setting up for some night shoots, hoping to capture the eerie atmosphere of the forest after dark. Sarah was adjusting the cameras while Mike set up our parabolic microphone, designed to pick up even the faintest sounds in the wilderness. "Hey, Alex," Mike called out, a note of confusion in his voice. "You gotta hear this." I put on the headphones he offered, and immediately felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Through the ambient sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the hoot of an owl, there was something else. A low, rhythmic thumping, almost like footsteps, but far too heavy to be human, and underneath that, a sound that made my blood run cold, a deep, guttural vocalization that was neither human nor any animal I recognized. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, not wanting to admit the chill of fear creeping up my spine. Jess listened next, her eyes widening. That sounds like the calls witnesses have reported, but I've never heard a recording this clear." We all gathered around the equipment, listening in stunned silence. The sounds continued for several minutes before fading away. "We have to go check it out," Jess said, already reaching for her backpack. Part of me wanted to say no, to pack up and head back to the safety of town, but the filmmaker in me couldn't resist the possibility of capturing something truly extraordinary. We grabbed our gear and headed in the direction of the sounds, our headlamps cutting through the darkness. The forest seemed different at night, the familiar shapes of trees and rocks transforming into looming shadows. We'd been walking for about 20 minutes when Sarah suddenly stopped. "Did you see that?" she whispered, pointing her camera off to our left. At first, I saw nothing. Then a movement caught my eye. Something large was moving through the trees just at the edge of our light's reach. It was hard to make out details, but the way it moved, it wasn't a bear, wasn't any animal I could identify. "Are you getting this?" I hissed to Sarah. She nodded, her camera trained on the spot. Mike had the microphone aimed in the same direction. For a few breathless moments, we stood frozen, watching the shape move through the forest. And then, suddenly, it was gone. We looked at each other, a mix of excitement and fear on everyone's faces. "Tell me you got that on camera," I said to Sarah. She nodded, already reviewing the footage. But as we huddled around the camera's small screen, our excitement turned to confusion. The video showed the forest, our lights sweeping across the trees. But where we had seen the mysterious shape, there was nothing. Just more trees and shadows. "But that's impossible," Sarah muttered, rewinding and playing the clip again. It was right there. We all saw it. A sense of unease settled over the group. We'd all seen something that apparently couldn't be captured on film. That's when we heard it again. That deep, rumbling vocalization, much closer this time. It was followed by the crack of breaking branches, as if something very large was moving through the underbrush directly toward us. "Run," Jess said, her voice tight with fear. And we did. We crashed through the forest, our gear banging against us as we ran. I could hear it behind us, a massive presence moving with shocking speed through the trees. We burst into a small clearing, panting and terrified, and that's when we saw it. It stood at the edge of the clearing, a massive silhouette backlit by the moonlight, filtering through the trees. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, with a body covered in thick, matted fur. Its head was oddly shaped, a blend of ape-like and human features that sent a chill through me. For a long moment, we all stood frozen, staring at this impossible creature. It stared back, and I felt the weight of an ancient alien intelligence in its gaze. Sarah's camera whirred to life, breaking the spell. The creature's head snapped toward the sound, its lips pulling back in a snarl that revealed frighteningly human-like teeth. It let out a roar that shook the very ground and charged. We scattered, running in different directions. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. Behind me, I could hear the others crashing through the forest, and underneath that, the heavy footfalls of something much larger in pursuit. I don't know how long I ran. My lungs were burning, my legs threatening to give out. But finally, mercifully, I saw lights ahead. The campsite, safety. I burst into the clearing where we'd set up our tents, collapsing to my knees. One by one, the others arrived, all of us gasping for breath and wide-eyed with terror. As our panic subsided, we began to compare notes on what we'd seen. We'd all glimpsed the creature, all felt the weight of its gaze, but as we checked our equipment, our hearts sank. The cameras had malfunctioned, producing nothing but static and blurred images. The audio recordings were distorted. The clear vocalizations we'd heard earlier now buried under a wall of white noise. We spent a sleepless night in the camp, jumping at every sound, convinced that at any moment the creature would burst out of the forest to finish what it had started. But morning came without incident, the forest peaceful in the early light. As we hiked back to civilization, we debated what to do. We had no evidence, nothing but our own terrified testimonies. In the end, we decided to include the experience in our documentary, presenting it as a dramatic reenactment of a Bigfoot encounter. The show aired to mixed reviews. Some praised its intensity and realism. Others criticized it as sensationalism, accusing us of exaggerating for ratings. Only we knew the truth, that what we presented as fiction was, in fact, a pale shadow of the reality we'd experienced. It's been years since that night in the forest. I've gone on to make other documentaries, to tell other stories, but I've never been able to shake the memory of those eyes staring at me from the darkness, that sense of being in the presence of something ancient and unknowable. I've been back to those woods many times since, hoping to catch another glimpse, to capture some evidence of what we saw. Sometimes, when the light hits the trees just right, I think I see a large shape moving in the shadows. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I think I hear that distinctive call echoing through the valleys. But I've never seen it clearly again, and part of me is glad. Because now I understand that there are some things in this world that aren't meant to be documented, some mysteries that aren't meant to be solved, So if you're ever watching a documentary about Bigfoot or any other creature of legend, remember this. Sometimes the truth is stranger and far more terrifying than anything we can put on film. And sometimes the most important stories are the ones that remain untold. Story 15. I never believed in monsters. As a forest ranger, I'd seen my fair share of wildlife, but nothing prepared me for what I encountered that night in Blackwood National Park. My name is Sarah Miller, and this is the story of how I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist. It was a crisp autumn evening when I received the call. Campers in the eastern sector reported strange noises and something big moving through the trees. Normally, I'd brush it off as an overzealous hiker mistaking a bear for Bigfoot, but the panic in their voices gave me pause. I grabbed my gear and headed out, telling myself it was probably just a black bear raiding coolers. The sun was setting as I parked my truck at the trailhead. A chill ran down my spine, and I pulled my jacket tighter. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The forest was too quiet, like all the animals were holding their breath. I switched on my flashlight and started down the trail, my boots crunching on fallen leaves. The beam of light danced across the trees, creating eerie shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I shook my head, trying to clear the creeping unease that was settling over me. As I neared the campsite, I heard hushed voices. I called out, "Forest Service! Everything okay here?" Two pale faces peeked out from a tent. A young couple, probably in their early 20s, emerged looking shaken. The woman, her blonde hair disheveled, spoke first. "Thank God you're here. We saw something." Her partner, a lanky guy with glasses, nodded vigorously. "It was huge, like impossibly big. We thought it was a bear at first, but..." I held up a hand, trying to calm them down. "Okay, let's start from the beginning. What exactly did you see?" They exchanged glances before the woman continued. "We were sitting by the fire when we heard this, I don't know, like a low growl, but deeper than any animal I've ever heard. Then we saw movement in the trees. It was dark, but we could make out this massive shape. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. It was walking on 2 legs, the man added, his voice barely above a whisper. No bear moves like that." I felt a knot forming in my stomach, but kept my face neutral. "All right, I'm going to take a look around. You two stay in your tent and keep quiet. I'll be back soon." As I moved away from the campsite, I clicked off my flashlight. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I strained my ears for any unusual sounds. The forest remained unnaturally silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I'd been walking for about 10 minutes when I heard it. A low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My heart rate spiked, and I instinctively crouched down, scanning the tree line. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, darker than the surrounding night. But as my eyes focused, I could make out a massive, hulking shape moving between the trees. It was easily 8 feet tall, maybe more, with broad shoulders and long arms that nearly reached the ground. The creature moved with an eerie grace, each step deliberate and silent despite its size. I held my breath, afraid that even the slightest sound would alert it to my presence. As it passed through a patch of moonlight, I caught a glimpse of dense, dark fur covering its body. Its head was large and somewhat pointed, almost dog-like, but the proportions were all wrong for any canine I'd ever seen. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. A bear standing on its hind legs, some kind of escaped zoo animal. But deep down, I knew this was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. The creature paused, its head turning slowly in my direction. I saw the gleam of eyes reflecting the moonlight, and for a moment I could have sworn they looked almost intelligent. A low growl emanated from its throat, causing the hair on the back of my neck to stand on end. I don't know how long we stayed like that, frozen in a silent standoff. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a minute or two. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature turned and loped off into the darkness, its massive form quickly swallowed by the shadows. I remained crouched, my heart pounding in my ears, for several more minutes. When I finally found the courage to move, my legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. I fumbled for my flashlight, needing its reassuring beam to combat the oppressive darkness that now felt alive with hidden threats. As I made my way back to the campsite, my mind whirled with questions. What had I just seen? How was I going to report this? Who would even believe me? The couple was still huddled in their tent when I returned. I did my best to reassure them, saying I hadn't seen anything unusual. But I'm not sure they bought it. I must have looked as shaken as I felt. I spent the rest of the night patrolling the area, jumping at every snapping twig and rustling leaf. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I finally allowed myself to relax a little. Whatever I had encountered seemed to have moved on, but my ordeal wasn't over. As I did one final sweep of the area before heading back, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, in a patch of soft earth, was a footprint. But not just any footprint. This was massive, easily twice the size of my own boot, with clear impressions of long, curved claws at the end of each toe. I stared at it for a long time, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This was evidence, proof that I hadn't imagined the events of the night before, but as I reached for my phone to take a picture, I hesitated. Who would believe this? I'd be laughed out of the ranger station, maybe even lose my job. And if word got out, this quiet corner of the forest would be overrun with cryptid hunters and thrill-seekers, destroying the very wilderness I'd sworn to protect. In the end, I did what I felt I had to do. I carefully obscured the print, erasing any trace of the creature's passage. As I drove back to the ranger station, I wrestled with my decision. Was I doing the right thing by keeping this to myself, or was I potentially putting people in danger? I've replayed that night in my mind 1,000 times since then. Sometimes I managed to convince myself that it was just a bear, that my eyes were playing tricks on me in the darkness. But then I remember those intelligent eyes, that low growl that seemed to vibrate through my very bones, and I know the truth. There are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk in the shadows of our civilization. I've seen one with my own eyes, and the experience has forever changed me. Now, when I patrol the forests at night, I'm always on alert, always watching the tree line, because I know that somewhere out there in the vast wilderness, something is watching back, and next time I might not be so lucky. Story 16. I used to think the worst thing that could happen on a camping trip was forgetting the marshmallows. Now, I'd give anything to go back to that blissful ignorance. My name is Mike Thompson, and what my daughter and I experienced in the Cascade Mountains will haunt us for the rest of our lives. It was supposed to be a simple father-daughter bonding trip. Emily had just turned 12, and I wanted to share my love of the outdoors with her before she hit those rebellious teenage years. We packed up our gear, drove out to a secluded campsite I'd used many times before, and set up our tent under a canopy of towering pines. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine needles and wilderness. It should have been perfect. The first day went exactly as planned. We hiked, fished in a nearby stream, and Emily delighted in identifying various plants and animals with the guidebook I'd bought her. As the sun began to set, we gathered around our small campfire, roasting hot dogs and sharing stories. Emily's laughter echoed through the trees, and I felt a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the fire. It wasn't until well after midnight that things began to change. I was jolted awake by a sound I'd never heard before, a howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't the familiar cry of a wolf or coyote. This was something different, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Emily stirred beside me. "Dad!" Her voice was small, frightened. "What was that?" I tried to keep my voice steady. "Probably just a wolf, honey. Nothing to worry about. Go back to sleep." But sleep didn't come. The howl sounded again, closer this time, and I felt Emily press against me, trembling. I wrapped an arm around her, my mind racing. In all my years of camping, I'd never encountered anything like this. As the night wore on, the howls grew more frequent, and were joined by other, equally unsettling sounds. Branches snapping, heavy footfalls circling our campsite, and a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Emily had eventually fallen into a fitful sleep, but I had remained wide awake, every muscle tense, straining to identify the sounds in the darkness. "Let's get some breakfast," I said, trying to inject some normalcy into the situation. But as soon as we unzipped the tent, we realized that our night of terror was far from over. Our campsite looked like it had been hit by a whirlwind. The folding chairs were overturned, our cooler was on its side, with its contents strewn across the ground, and deep claw marks scored the sides of our food storage container. But what really made my blood run cold were the footprints. They were everywhere, circling our tent, leading to and from the tree line, and they were huge, easily twice the size of my own boot print, with clear impressions of long, curved claws at the tips of the toes. Whatever had made these wasn't a bear or any other animal I was familiar with. Emily's grip on my hand tightened. "Dad," she whispered, "what did this?" I swallowed hard, trying to find words that would reassure her without lying. "I'm not sure, sweetheart, but we're going to pack up and head home, okay?" She nodded, her face pale, and we began to gather our belongings as quickly as we could. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made us jump. The forest that had seemed so welcoming yesterday now felt oppressive, as if 1,000 unseen eyes were watching our every move. We were almost finished packing when we heard it, a low, rumbling growl coming from the tree line behind us. Slowly, I turned, pushing Emily behind me. There, half hidden in the shadows of the forest, stood a creature that defied explanation. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in shaggy dark fur. Its head was vaguely canine in shape, but the proportions were all wrong. And its eyes, God, its eyes. They were intelligent, almost human-like, and filled with a hunger that made my insides turn to ice. "Emily," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "when I say run, I want you to run to the car as fast as you can. Don't look back, just run. Understand?" I felt her nod against my back. The creature took a step forward, its massive frame moving with an unnatural grace. I reached down slowly, grasping a heavy branch that lay near my feet. "Run!" I shouted, hurling the branch at the beast. It let out a roar that shook the very air around us, and I turned, sprinting after Emily towards our parked car. I've never run so fast in my life. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't slow down. I could hear heavy footfalls behind me, gaining ground with each passing second. Emily reached the car first, yanking open the passenger door and diving in. I was only steps behind her, fumbling with the keys as I slammed my door shut. The engine roared to life just as a massive form burst from the tree line. I threw the car into reverse, tires spinning on the dirt road as we shot backwards. In the rearview mirror, I caught a final glimpse of the creature. It stood in the middle of the road, watching us go. Even from a distance, I could see the intelligence in its eyes, the calculated hunger. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. This was something else entirely. We drove in silence for a long time, both of us too shaken to speak. It wasn't until we were back on the main highway that Emily finally broke the silence. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling, "what was that thing?" I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. "I don't know, sweetheart. I really don't know." In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to rationalize what we had seen. Maybe it was a bear, I told myself, or some kind of escaped exotic animal. But deep down, I knew the truth. We had encountered something that shouldn't exist, something that lurked in the shadows of our world, defying explanation. I reported the incident to the local rangers, of course, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes as I recounted our story. They promised to investigate, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. Whatever that creature was, it was too intelligent, too careful to leave evidence for humans to find. Emily had nightmares for months afterward. She would wake up screaming, describing gleaming eyes and massive claws reaching for her in the darkness. I did my best to comfort her. But how do you reassure someone when you're just as terrified as they are? We never went camping again after that. The wilderness that I had once loved now filled me with a deep, primal fear. Every time I look at a forest now, I can't help but wonder what might be lurking just beyond the tree line, watching and waiting. Some nights, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear that howl again, carried on the breeze from some distant, shadowy place. And I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, remembering those intelligent eyes and wondering, if we encountered one of these creatures, how many more are out there? And what happens when they decide to venture out of the wilderness and into our world? I used to think I knew the natural world. Now I realize how little we truly understand about the creatures we share this planet with. There are things out there, in the dark spaces between civilizations, that defy explanation. And once you've seen them, once you know they exist, you can never go back to the comfort of ignorance. So the next time you're in the woods and you hear a strange sound or see a shadow move in a way it shouldn't, remember my story. Remember that there are things in this world that we can't explain, creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of our understanding. And whatever you do, don't ignore that primal voice inside you that says to run, because sometimes that voice is the only thing standing between you and the unknown horrors that wait in the wild. Story 17. I've always loved the mountains, the crisp air, the challenging trails, the sense of accomplishment when you reach a summit. But after what happened in the Adirondacks last fall, I can't look at a forested peak without feeling a chill run down my spine. My name is Alex Chen, and this is the story of how a simple hiking trip turned into a nightmare that still haunts me. It was supposed to be a weekend adventure, just me and 4 friends from college celebrating our 5-year reunion. We chose a remote trail, eager to escape the crowds and immerse ourselves in nature. Looking back, I realize how naive we were, how unprepared for the horrors that awaited us in those ancient woods. The trouble started on our second day. We had planned to reach the summit by mid-afternoon, but a wrong turn set us back hours. As the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the trail, a sense of unease settled over our group. We should find a place to camp, Sarah, always the voice of reason, suggested. It's not safe to hike in the dark. We all agreed, though none of us were thrilled about spending an unplanned night on the mountain. We found a small clearing just off the trail and quickly set up our tents. As we huddled around our small campfire, trying to laugh off our misadventure, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was just after midnight when we heard it, a scream that cut through the darkness like a knife. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite human, not quite animal. The sound echoed off the mountains, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We all froze, exchanging wide-eyed glances in the flickering firelight. "What the hell was that?" Mike whispered, his voice tight with fear. Before anyone could answer, we heard it again, closer this time. The scream was followed by the sound of something large moving through the underbrush, branches snapping under heavy footfalls. "Get in the tents!" I hissed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. We scrambled to extinguish the fire and retreat to the fragile safety of our nylon shelters. I ended up in a tent with Sarah and Mike, while Jen and Chris took the other. We lay there in the darkness, barely breathing, straining our ears for any sound of the creature that had made that terrible scream. The silence stretched on, broken only by the usual nighttime sounds of the forest. Just as I was beginning to think we had overreacted, that it had been nothing more than a mountain lion or a bear, we heard it again. A blood-curdling shriek, so close it seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath us. Sarah let out a muffled sob, and I felt Mike trembling beside me. I wanted to reassure them, to say that everything would be okay, but the words stuck in my throat because at that moment I saw it. A shadow passed in front of our tent, backlit by the moon. It was enormous, far larger than a person, moving on two legs with an odd, loping gait. The silhouette showed a creature with long arms that nearly touched the ground, a large, somewhat pointed head, and what looked like shaggy fur covering its body. We lay there, frozen in terror, as the creature circled our campsite. I could hear its heavy breathing, smell a musky odor that turned my stomach. It paused in front of our tent, and for one heart-stopping moment I thought it might tear through the thin fabric that separated us. But then it moved on, its footsteps fading into the forest. We waited, hardly daring to breathe, for what felt like hours. When we finally felt it was safe to move, I fumbled for my flashlight with shaking hands. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered, her face pale in the beam of light. "We need to get out of here," Mike said. "As soon as it's light, we pack up and get off this mountain." I nodded in agreement, but a nagging thought kept tugging at my mind. What about Jen and Chris? We need to check on them. Slowly, cautiously, we unzipped the tent. The clearing was eerily quiet, bathed in pale moonlight. Everything looked normal, untouched. Except for one thing, the other tent was gone. Panic surged through me as I swept my flashlight across the clearing. There was no sign of Jen and Chris or their tent. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. "Jen! Chris!" I called out, my voice sounding small and frightened in the vast darkness of the forest. There was no response. We spent the rest of the night huddled in our remaining tent, jumping at every sound, convinced that at any moment the creature would return. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, we emerged, exhausted and terrified. In the harsh light of day, we could see signs of the previous night's visitor. Massive footprints circled our campsite, each one easily twice the size of my own foot. Long claw marks scored several nearby trees, higher up than any bear could reach. But the most chilling discovery came when we found Jen and Chris's tent. It was about 100 yards from our campsite, shredded to ribbons. There was no sign of our friends, just a few scraps of clothing and a smear of what looked horribly like blood on a nearby rock. Reality hit us like a punch to the gut. This wasn't some elaborate prank or a case of our imaginations running wild. Something had taken our friends, something that shouldn't exist outside of campfire stories and cryptid forums. We didn't waste any time. Grabbing only the essentials, we started down the mountain at a frantic pace. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through us. We were convinced that at any moment we'd hear that terrible scream again, that the creature would emerge from the trees to finish what it had started. It wasn't until we reached the ranger station at the base of the mountain that we allowed ourselves to slow down. We burst through the door, babbling about monsters and missing friends. The rangers looked at us like we were crazy, but something in our eyes, the raw fear in our voices, convinced them to take us seriously. A search and rescue operation was launched immediately. For days, teams combed the mountain, looking for any sign of Jen and Chris. But they found nothing, no bodies, no additional evidence, nothing to corroborate our fantastic story. In the end, Jen and Chris were listed as missing, presumed dead from a hiking accident. The official report mentioned nothing about giant footprints or shredded tents. It was as if the entire incident had been scrubbed clean, reduced to a tragic but mundane accident. But we know the truth. Sarah, Mike, and I, we remember what we saw that night. We've tried to move on with our lives, but the memory of that creature, of its terrible scream, haunts us. We've researched, reaching out to others who have had similar experiences, and we've learned that we're not alone. There are things out there, in the wild places of the world, that defy explanation. I don't go hiking anymore. The mountains that once called to me now fill me with dread, because I know that somewhere out there, hidden in the vast wilderness, there are monsters, real flesh and blood creatures that prey on the unwary. And the most terrifying thing, most people have no idea they exist. So the next time you're in the woods and you hear a sound you can't quite place or see a shadow move in a way it shouldn't, remember my story. Remember that there are things in this world that we don't understand, creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of civilization. And whatever you do, don't ignore that primal instinct that tells you to run, because sometimes that instinct is all that stands between you and the unknown horrors that wait in the wild. As for me, I'll stick to the safety of the city. But even here, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I sometimes think I hear a distant, inhuman scream, and I lie awake, wondering about Jen and Chris and about what other secrets those mountains might be hiding. Story 18. I've been a hunter for 30 years, tracking everything from deer to bear across the rugged wilderness of northern Michigan. I thought I'd seen it all, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered last fall. My name is John Erickson, and this is the story of how I became the prey. It was the first week of deer season, and I'd ventured deeper into the Hiawatha National Forest than ever before. I'd heard rumors of a massive buck in the area, a ghost that had eluded hunters for years. The challenge was irresistible. The first 2 days were uneventful. I tracked game trails, set up my tree stand, and waited patiently. But on the third morning, everything changed. I woke before dawn, the crisp autumn air biting at my exposed skin as I emerged from my tent. The forest was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. As I gathered my gear, I noticed something odd. The usual morning chorus of birds was absent. An uneasy feeling settled in my gut, but I brushed it off. I had a buck to find. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the canopy, I made my way to a promising spot I'd scouted the day before. That's when I saw it, a deer carcass, or what was left of it. The animal had been torn apart, its ribcage splayed open like a grisly flower. This was no ordinary predator kill. The violence of the scene sent a chill down my spine. I approached cautiously, my rifle at the ready. The ground around the carcass was a mess of tracks, but one set stood out. They were huge, easily twice the size of my boot, with distinct claw marks at the tips. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. A bear, maybe, but something about the shape was off, more like a massive canine print than anything ursine. As I crouched to examine the tracks more closely, a twig snapped somewhere behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding, but saw nothing but trees and underbrush. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I decided to head back to camp. Whatever had killed that deer was still out there, and I had no desire to become its next meal. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A tuft of coarse, dark hair snagged on a low-hanging branch. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, too long and thick to be from any animal native to these woods. The walk back to camp was tense. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. When I finally reached my tent, relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. My campsite was in shambles. The tent was shredded, my supplies scattered across the forest floor. Deep claw marks scored the trees surrounding the clearing. Whatever had done this was big, and it was angry. Panic set in as I realized my satellite phone was among the destroyed equipment. I was alone, miles from the nearest road, with no way to call for help. And something was out there, something big enough to make those tracks and do this kind of damage. I grabbed what supplies I could salvage and started moving. My only hope was to make it back to my truck, parked miles away at the trailhead. As I hiked, my senses were on high alert. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush made me flinch. The sun was setting by the time I decided to stop for the night. I found a sturdy-looking oak and climbed as high as I dared, securing myself to the trunk with a length of paracord. It wasn't comfortable, but it felt safer than being on the ground. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with nighttime sounds, but underneath the familiar calls of owls and the chirping of insects, there was something else. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My hands shook as I gripped my rifle tighter. Then I saw it. A massive shape moving through the trees below, easily 8 feet tall and covered in shaggy, dark fur. It moved with an unnatural grace for something so large, its head swiveling as if searching for something. Searching for me, I realized with a jolt of terror. I held my breath, praying that it wouldn't look up. For what felt like hours, the creature circled the base of my tree. Occasionally, it would pause and sniff the air, and I swear I could see the gleam of intelligence in its eyes. This was no ordinary animal. Just when I thought my arms would give out from clinging so tightly to the tree, the creature moved on. I listened to its heavy footfalls fade into the distance, but I didn't dare move. I spent the rest of the night in that tree, every muscle tense, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, I climbed down on shaky legs. The forest floor was crisscrossed with those massive tracks, a stark reminder that last night wasn't just a terror-induced hallucination. I started moving again, pushing myself harder than ever before. I had to get out of these woods. It was mid-afternoon when I heard it again, that low, rumbling growl, closer this time, much closer. I broke into a run, all thoughts of stealth forgotten. I could hear it behind me, branches snapping under its weight as it gave chase. I've never run so fast in my life. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't dare slow down. I could feel it getting closer, the sound of its breathing growing louder with each passing second. Just as I thought it was over, that I couldn't run another step, I burst through the tree line into the parking area. My truck sat there, a beautiful sight I never thought I'd see again. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. As I sped down the dirt road, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror. There, at the edge of the forest, stood a creature that shouldn't exist. It was massive, its body covered in dark fur, with a head that was a nightmarish blend of wolf and bear. But it was the eyes that haunted me, intelligent, almost human-like, filled with a calculating hunger that made my blood run cold. I reported what happened, of course, but the rangers and local police just shook their heads, talking about bears and mountain lions. They didn't believe me. Hell, I'm not sure I would have believed me if I hadn't lived through it. In the weeks and months that followed, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a stress-induced hallucination. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was something out there in those woods, something that defied explanation. I don't hunt anymore. The thought of entering those dark forests, of being watched by unseen eyes, is more than I can bear. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I think I can hear that low, rumbling growl carried on the wind. And I lie awake, wondering about what other secrets those ancient woods might be hiding. So if you're ever in the wilderness, and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck like you're being watched, trust your instincts, because there are things out there, in the wild places of the world, that we can't explain, things that turn hunters into prey, that lurk just beyond the edge of firelight, waiting. And if you hear a twig snap behind you, or see a shadow move in a way it shouldn't, don't dismiss it. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because sometimes the monsters in our campfire stories are more real than we'd like to believe. And the only thing standing between you and them is how fast you can get away. As for me, I'll stick to the safety of civilization. But every time I look at the tree line, every time I hear an unexplained sound in the night, I remember, and I wonder, with a mixture of fear and awe, what other creatures might be out there, watching and waiting in the shadows of our world. Story 19. I've spent my entire career studying the intricate dance of predator and prey in the wild. But nothing in my years of research could have prepared me for the night when my team and I became the subjects of an entirely different kind of observation. My name is Dr. Emily Rawlings, and this is the story of how our routine wildlife study turned into a terrifying encounter with something beyond our understanding. It was supposed to be a straightforward expedition. Our team of 5 researchers had set up camp in a remote area of the Olympic National Park, known for its diverse ecosystem and elusive wildlife. We were there to study the hunting patterns of the local cougar population using state-of-the-art camera traps and tracking devices. Little did we know, we were about to capture something far more extraordinary and dangerous on our equipment. The first few days were uneventful. We set up our gear, checked our camera feeds, and collected data on the local fauna. It wasn't until the 4th night that things took a turn for the bizarre. I was reviewing the day's footage in our main tent when I noticed something odd. At first, I thought it was just a glitch in the camera, a shadow moving in a way it shouldn't. But as I rewound and replayed the clip, my blood ran cold. There, just at the edge of the frame, was a figure. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, and covered in what looked like dark, shaggy fur. But it was the way it moved that really caught my attention, not like any animal I'd ever seen, but with an almost human-like gait. "Hey, guys," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "You might want to take a look at this." My team gathered around the laptop, their expressions shifting from curiosity to disbelief as they watched the footage. "That's got to be a bear, right?" Jake, our junior researcher, suggested nervously. I shook my head. "No bear moves like that. And look at the proportions. Those arms are too long, the shoulders too broad." We spent the next hour reviewing all our camera feeds, and what we found chilled us to the bone. The creature appeared in several other clips, always at the periphery, always just barely visible. But in one nighttime shot, we caught a clear glimpse of its face. It was like nothing we'd ever seen, a blend of ape and wolf, with eyes that reflected the camera's infrared light in an unnervingly intelligent way. "We need to report this," Sarah, our field biologist, insisted. "Whatever this thing is, it's not supposed to be here." But as we reached for our satellite phone, a bone-chilling howl cut through the night air. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, not quite wolf, not quite human, but something in between that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We all froze, exchanging panicked glances. Then we heard it. Heavy footsteps circling our camp, accompanied by a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground. "Everyone stay calm," I whispered, though my own heart was racing. "Get to the equipment tent. We need to—" My words were cut off by a deafening roar, followed by the sound of ripping fabric. Something large and powerful was tearing into our supply tent. We huddled together in the main tent, hardly daring to breathe as we listened to the chaos outside. The creature moved from tent to tent, ripping through our equipment with terrifying ease. I could hear our camera gear being smashed, our samples scattered to the wind. Hours passed like this, with us trapped in our flimsy nylon shelter, while the thing outside systematically destroyed our camp. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, an eerie silence fell. Cautiously, we emerged from the tent. The scene that greeted us was one of utter devastation. Our equipment lay in ruins, scattered across the clearing. Deep claw marks scored the trees surrounding our camp, higher up than any bear could reach. And there, in the soft earth, were footprints that defied explanation, massive, with clear impressions of opposable thumbs and long, curved claws. But the most chilling discovery came when we checked our backup hard drive. Every piece of footage, every scrap of data we'd collected, had been corrupted beyond recovery. It was as if something had deliberately erased all evidence of its existence. "We need to get out of here," Mike, our tech specialist, said, his voice shaking. "Now?" No one argued. We grabbed what little gear had survived the night and started the long hike back to civilization. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush made us jump. We couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, followed by something that didn't want us to leave with what we'd seen. It wasn't until we reached the ranger station that we allowed ourselves to relax, if only slightly. We reported what had happened, of course, but the skepticism in the ranger's eyes was clear. Without our footage or data, our story sounded like the ravings of a group that had spent too long in the wilderness. In the days and weeks that followed, we tried to make sense of what we'd experienced. We reached out to cryptozoologists, to experts in local folklore, to anyone who might be able to shed light on what we'd encountered. But the more we dug, the more questions we uncovered. There were other reports, it turned out. Hikers who had gone missing in that area, only to turn up days later with no memory of what had happened. Campers who spoke of eerie howls in the night and a sense of being watched by something just beyond the firelight. But nothing concrete, nothing that could prove what we knew to be true. The scientific community dismissed our claims, of course. Without hard evidence, our encounter was written off as a bear attack, or mass hysteria brought on by isolation and stress. Our reputations took a hit, and funding for our future projects dried up. But we know what we saw, we know what we experienced, and we can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching and waiting. I don't go into the field anymore. The thought of being in those dark forests, of feeling those intelligent eyes upon me, is more than I can bear. But I haven't given up my search for answers. I've dedicated my life to understanding what's really out there, lurking in the shadows of our world. Sometimes, late at night when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear that unearthly howl carried on the breeze, and I lie awake, wondering about what other secrets those ancient forests might be hiding. So if you're ever in the wilderness, and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, like you're being observed, trust your instincts. Because there are things out there in the wild places of the world that defy our understanding. Things that turn observers into the observed, that lurk just beyond the edge of what we know, waiting to be discovered. And if you do encounter something you can't explain, something that shouldn't exist outside of legend and myth, remember our story. Document everything you can, but be prepared for the possibility that the evidence might vanish. Because whatever's out there, it's smart. It knows how to hide, how to erase its tracks. As for me, I'll keep searching for answers, because I know the truth. There are creatures in this world that we've yet to classify, beings that challenge everything we think we know about nature and evolution. And someday, somehow, I'm going to prove it. Until then, I'll keep watching the forests, always aware that something out there might be watching back. Story 20. I used to love my morning runs. The solitude, the crisp air, the rhythm of my feet hitting the trail. It was my time to clear my head and start the day right. But after what happened last spring in Oakwood Forest, I can't step onto a wooded path without my heart racing, and not from exertion. My name is Lisa Connor, and this is the story of the morning run that turned into a nightmare. It was a perfect April morning when I set out on my usual trail. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. The air was cool and damp, filled with the earthy scent of new growth. As I started my warm-up jog, I felt that familiar sense of peace settle over me. Little did I know, it would be the last time I'd feel that way for a long, long time. I was about 2 miles into my run when I first noticed something odd. The usual morning chorus of birds had gone silent. The forest felt unnaturally still, as if holding its breath. I slowed my pace, suddenly aware of how loud my footfalls seemed in the quiet. That's when I saw the tracks. At first, I thought they were from a large dog. We got plenty of those on the trail, But as I looked closer, I realized these were different. They were huge, easily twice the size of my running shoe, with distinct claw marks at the tips of each toe. And they were fresh, the edges still crisp in the soft earth. A chill ran down my spine as I realized whatever had made these tracks was big, really big. And it had been here recently. I looked around, suddenly feeling exposed. The trees that had seemed so welcoming just moments ago now loomed ominously, hiding who knows what in their shadows. I decided to cut my run short and head back. As I turned, a twig snapped somewhere off to my left. I froze, straining my ears. For a long moment there was nothing but silence. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very air. My heart began to race as I slowly turned towards the sound. At first, I saw nothing but trees and underbrush. Then a shadow moved, and I caught a glimpse of something that shouldn't exist outside of nightmares. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with a broad, powerful frame covered in dark, shaggy fur. Its head was a terrifying blend of wolf and bear, with gleaming eyes that fixed on me with an intelligence that made my blood run cold. For a split second we stared at each other, predator and prey, frozen in a moment of mutual shock. Then my survival instincts kicked in, and I ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, my feet barely touching the ground as I tore down the trail. I could hear it behind me, branches snapping and undergrowth rustling as it gave chase. The sound of its pursuit drove me to push harder, to run faster. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't dare slow down. I could feel it getting closer, its heavy breathing growing louder with each passing second. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, that my legs would give out and I'd fall prey to whatever was chasing me, I burst out of the tree line into the parking area. My car sat there, a beautiful sight I never thought I'd be so glad to see. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. As I finally managed to unlock it and throw myself inside, I caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the forest. There, half hidden by the trees, stood the creature. It made no move to follow me into the open, but the look in its eyes sent a shiver down my spine. There was calculation there, and a hunger that had nothing to do with mere animal instinct. I sped out of the parking lot, my tires squealing on the pavement. It wasn't until I was miles away, safely back in the heart of the suburbs, that I allowed myself to relax my death grip on the steering wheel. For days afterward, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a hallucination, a trick of the light combined with an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had seen something that day, something that shouldn't exist. I reported the incident, of course, but the park rangers just shook their heads, talking about bears and mountain lions. They didn't believe me. Hell, I'm not sure I would have believed me if I hadn't lived through it, but I couldn't shake the memory of those intelligent eyes, of the way it had moved with a grace that belied its size. This was no ordinary animal. This was something else entirely. In the weeks that followed, I dove into research, reaching out to cryptozoologists and experts in local folklore. I discovered that I wasn't alone in my experience. There were other reports, whispered stories of hikers and runners encountering something large and inexplicable in those woods. Some called it Dogman, others Sasquatch or Wendigo. But whatever name they gave it, the descriptions were eerily similar to what I had seen. A massive, bipedal creature, covered in fur, with a face that was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features. The more I learned, the more questions I had. If these creatures were real, how had they remained hidden for so long? How many of them were out there? And most chillingly, what did they want? I don't run in the forest anymore. The thought of those trails, once my sanctuary, now fills me with dread. But I can't shake the feeling that my encounter wasn't random, that for some reason I was chosen to see what I saw. Sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear a distant, inhuman howl carried on the breeze, and I lie awake, wondering if it's out there, watching and waiting for another chance to reveal itself. So if you're ever out in the woods, and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck like you're being watched, trust your instincts. Because there are things out there, in the wild places of the world, that we can't explain. Things that turn a peaceful morning run into a fight for survival, that lurk just beyond the edge of what we think we know about the natural world. And if you hear a twig snap behind you, or catch a glimpse of something large moving in the shadows, don't hesitate. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because sometimes the monsters in our campfire stories are more real than we'd like to believe. And the only thing standing between you and them is how fast you can get away. As for me, I've traded my trail runs for a treadmill in the safety of a well-lit gym. But I can't stop thinking about what I saw that day. I know it's out there, somewhere in those dark forests. And part of me, the part that isn't paralyzed by fear, wonders if someday I'll find the courage to go back, to seek answers to the questions that haunt my dreams. Because once you've seen something like that, once you know that the world is bigger and stranger than you ever imagined, you can never truly go back to the comfort of ignorance. You become a watcher, always alert, always wondering what other secrets might be hiding just beyond the veil of what we call reality. So the next time you're in nature and you feel that unexplainable urge to look over your shoulder, remember my story. Remember that there are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that blur the line between legend and reality. And whatever you do, don't ignore that primal voice inside you that says to run. Because sometimes that voice is the only thing standing between you and the unknown horrors that wait in the wild. Story 21. I used to think the scariest thing about camping was the possibility of bears raiding our cooler. Now, I'd give anything to go back to that blissful ignorance. My name is Jake Thompson, and what my friends and I experienced in the Adirondacks last summer will haunt us for the rest of our lives. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway, just 4 high school buddies reuniting after our first year of college. We chose a remote campsite, eager to escape the crowds and immerse ourselves in nature. The area had a reputation for strange sightings, but we laughed it off as local superstition. We were young, invincible, and utterly unprepared for the terror that awaited us. The first day was perfect. We hiked, swam in a crystal-clear lake, and spent the evening around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories about our new college lives. As night fell, the forest came alive with the usual sounds: crickets chirping, owls hooting, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It was peaceful, almost magical. "Hey, did you guys hear about the legend of this place?" Mike, always the horror enthusiast, asked with a mischievous grin. We groaned collectively, but secretly. We loved Mike's scary stories. They were a camping tradition. "And apparently there's some kind of creature that roams these woods," Mike continued, his voice dropping to a dramatic whisper. "The locals call it the Adirondack Beast. Half man, half animal. They say it stands over 8 feet tall and hunts under the full moon." "Which is tonight," Sarah added, glancing up at the bright orb hanging in the sky. We laughed nervously, trying to brush off the chill that ran down our spines. It was just a story, right? As the fire died down, we retired to our tents. I was sharing with Mike, while Sarah and Emily took the other tent. Despite the long day, I found myself lying awake, Mike's story playing on repeat in my mind. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves seemed amplified in the quiet night. It was just after midnight when we heard it, a howl that cut through the darkness like a knife. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before, not quite wolf, not quite human, but something in between that made my blood run cold. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Mike," I whispered, "did you hear that?" Mike nodded, his face pale in the dim moonlight filtering through the tent. "Maybe it's just a wolf," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. We heard it again, closer this time. Then came a sound that turned my blood to ice, heavy footsteps, circling our campsite. Whatever was out there, it was big. "We should check on the girls," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Slowly, we unzipped the tent and peered out. The clearing was bathed in eerie moonlight, shadows dancing between the trees. At first I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Then a movement caught my eye. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a figure that defied explanation. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with a broad, powerful frame covered in dark fur. Its head was a nightmarish blend of wolf and bear, with gleaming eyes that reflected the moonlight. But it was the intelligence in those eyes that truly terrified me. This was no mere animal. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as we stared at each other. Then the creature let out a roar that shook the very air around us, and chaos erupted. Sarah and Emily burst out of their tent, screaming. The beast charged into the clearing, moving with a speed that belied its size. We scrambled to get away, but in our panic, we separated. I found myself running blindly through the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. I could hear the others screaming in the distance, but the sound of my own pounding heart drowned out everything else. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. Eventually, I stumbled upon a small cave and wedged myself inside, trying to make myself as small as possible. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized with horror that the walls were scored with deep claw marks. This was its lair. Trapped, I could do nothing but wait, every muscle tense, straining to hear any sign of the creature's approach. The night seemed to stretch on forever, each second an eternity of terror. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I finally dared to emerge from my hiding place. The forest was eerily quiet, no birds singing, no small animals scurrying about. It felt as if the entire wood was holding its breath. Cautiously, I made my way back to our campsite. The scene that greeted me was one of utter devastation. Our tents were shredded, our supplies scattered across the clearing. Deep claw marks scored the trees surrounding the camp, higher up than any bear could reach. "Hello!" I called out, my voice hoarse and shaking. "Mike? Sarah? Emily?" For a heart-stopping moment, there was no response. Then I heard a faint cry coming from the direction of the lake. I ran towards the sound, hope and fear warring in my chest. I found them huddled together on the small dock, pale and shaking but alive. The relief I felt was overwhelming. We clung to each other, sobbing and laughing hysterically, unable to believe we had survived the night. As we pieced together our individual experiences, a chilling picture emerged. We had all seen the creature, all been chased by it. But more than that, we all had the sense that it had been toying with us, herding us like prey, demonstrating an intelligence far beyond that of a normal animal. We didn't waste any time packing up what little remained of our gear and getting out of those woods. The hike back to civilization was tense, every snapping twig making us jump. It wasn't until we were safely in Mike's car, speeding down the highway, that we allowed ourselves to relax. Of course, we reported what had happened to the park rangers, but the skepticism in their eyes was clear. Without any real evidence beyond our destroyed campsite, our story sounded like the ravings of kids who had let their imaginations run wild. In the weeks and months that followed, we tried to make sense of what we'd experienced. We reached out to cryptozoologists, to experts in local folklore, to anyone who might be able to shed light on what we'd encountered. But the more we dug, the more questions we uncovered. There were other reports, it turned out. Hikers who had gone missing in that area, only to turn up days later with no memory of what had happened. Campers who spoke of eerie howls in the night and a sense of being watched by something just beyond the firelight. But nothing concrete, nothing that could prove what we knew to be true. Most people dismissed our claims, of course. We were written off as attention-seeking kids, or the victims of an elaborate prank. But we know what we saw. We know what we experienced, and we can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching and waiting. I don't go camping anymore. The thought of being in those dark forests, of feeling those intelligent eyes upon me, is more than I can bear. But I can't let it go, either. I've become obsessed with understanding what's really out there, lurking in the shadows of our world. Sometimes, late at night when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear that unearthly howl carried on the breeze, and I lie awake, wondering about what other secrets those ancient forests might be hiding. So if you're ever in the wilderness, and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck like you're being watched, trust your instincts. Because there are things out there, in the wild places of the world, that defy our understanding. Things that turn a fun camping trip into a fight for survival, that lurk just beyond the edge of firelight, waiting to be discovered. And if you do encounter something you can't explain, something that shouldn't exist outside of legend and myth, remember our story. Don't dismiss it, don't try to rationalize it away, because sometimes the monsters in our campfire stories are more real than we'd like to believe, and the only thing standing between you and them is how well you listen to that primal voice inside that tells you when it's time to run. Story 22. I've captured images of lions in Africa, polar bears in the Arctic, and even great white sharks breaching off the coast of South Africa. But nothing in my 20 years as a wildlife photographer could have prepared me for what I encountered in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. My name is Tom Reeves, and this is the story of how a routine assignment turned into a terrifying brush with the unknown. It was supposed to be a straightforward job, a series of shots for a nature magazine highlighting the biodiversity of Olympic National Park. I'd been there before, captivated by its lush rainforests and rugged coastline, but this time I was venturing deeper into the backcountry, to areas rarely visited by tourists or casual hikers. The first few days were uneventful, filled with the usual challenges of outdoor photography. I got some great shots of Roosevelt elk, captured a family of river otters at play, and even managed to photograph an elusive cougar at dawn. But it was on the fourth day that everything changed. I had set up camp near a small clearing, hoping to catch some early morning wildlife activity. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I was already in position, my camera ready. The forest was coming alive with birdsong, and I felt that familiar thrill of anticipation. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow moving between the trees, too large and too fluid in its movements to be a bear. Instinctively, I raised my camera and started shooting. Through my telephoto lens, I could see details that made my blood run cold. The creature was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with a broad, powerful frame covered in dark, shaggy fur. Its head was a nightmarish blend of ape and wolf, with eyes that seemed to glow with an unnatural intelligence. It moved with a grace that belied its size, each step purposeful and silent. For a moment, I forgot to breathe, my finger automatically pressing the shutter release as the creature moved through my frame. Then, as if sensing my presence, it turned and looked directly at me. Those eyes, I'll never forget them. They weren't the eyes of an animal, but something else entirely, something that seemed to look right through me. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled backwards, nearly dropping my camera in the process. By the time I looked up again, the creature was gone, vanished into the shadows of the forest as silently as it had appeared. My hands shaking, I reviewed the images on my camera's display. There it was, unmistakable, a creature that shouldn't exist outside of legend and myth, captured in high-definition detail. I felt a mix of exhilaration and terror. I had proof of something extraordinary, something that could change our understanding of the natural world, but I also had a chilling sense that I had seen something I wasn't supposed to see. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, jumping at every sound, constantly looking over my shoulder. As night fell, I decided to break camp and head back to civilization. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, followed by something that didn't want me to leave with the evidence I'd captured. It was just after midnight when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Then came the sound of heavy footsteps circling my tent. I held my breath, clutching my camera bag to my chest. Whatever was out there, it knew I was here. It knew what I had seen, what I had captured on film. For hours, I lay there in terror as the creature prowled around my campsite. Occasionally, I would hear sniffing sounds, as if it was trying to catch my scent. As the first light of dawn broke, the sounds finally ceased. Cautiously, I unzipped my tent and peered out. The clearing was empty, but the signs of the night's visitor were everywhere. Deep footprints circled my tent, far larger than any known animal in these woods. Claw marks scored nearby trees at a height that made me shudder. I didn't waste any time. I packed up my gear and started the long hike back to my car, constantly looking over my shoulder, starting at every snapping twig. It wasn't until I was miles away, safely on the highway heading back to Seattle, that I allowed myself to relax. Back in my studio, I eagerly downloaded the images from my camera. My hands were shaking with excitement as I opened the first file, but my elation quickly turned to confusion, then despair. The images were there, but they were wrong, distorted, blurry, as if something had interfered with my camera at the moment I took the shot. In some, you could make out a vague, large shape, but nothing like the clear image I knew I had captured. I spent days poring over the photos, trying every trick I knew to enhance and clarify them, but it was no use. Whatever I had seen, whatever had stalked me that night, had somehow managed to obscure its image. I was left with nothing but memories and a handful of blurry photos that proved nothing. Of course, I reported what I had seen to the park rangers. But without clear evidence, my story sounded like the ravings of an overworked photographer with an overactive imagination. They nodded politely, made some notes, and I could see in their eyes that they didn't believe a word. In the weeks and months that followed, I became obsessed with understanding what I had encountered. I reached out to cryptozoologists, to experts in local folklore, to anyone who might be able to shed light on what I had seen. I discovered that I wasn't alone in my experience. There were other reports, whispered stories of hikers and campers encountering something large and inexplicable in those woods. Some called it Bigfoot, others Sasquatch, or even Wendigo. But whatever name they gave it, the descriptions were eerily similar to what I had seen. A massive bipedal creature covered in fur, with a face that was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features. The more I learned, the more questions I had. If these creatures were real, how had they remained hidden for so long? How many of them were out there? And most chillingly, what did they want? I've returned to Olympic National Park several times since that day, hoping to catch another glimpse, to get that clear shot that would prove once and for all what I had seen. But each time, I've come back empty-handed, with nothing but a growing sense of unease. Sometimes, when I'm out in the wilderness with my camera, I feel that prickle on the back of my neck, that sense of being watched. And I wonder, is it out there, right now, just beyond the reach of my lens? Is it watching me? As I've watched so many other creatures through my camera, I don't know if I'll ever get the answers I'm looking for, but I can't stop searching. Because once you've seen something like that, once you know that the world is bigger and stranger than you ever imagined, you can never truly go back to the comfort of ignorance. So if you're ever in the wilderness and you feel that inexplicable urge to look over your shoulder, remember my story. Remember that there are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that blur the line between legend and reality. And if you're lucky enough, or unlucky enough, to catch a glimpse of something extraordinary, don't dismiss it. Document it if you can, but be prepared for the possibility that the evidence might vanish. Because whatever's out there, it's smart, It knows how to hide, how to erase its tracks, and it's watching us, always watching, from the shadows of a world we thought we understood. As for me, I'll keep venturing into the wilderness with my camera, because I know the truth. There are wonders out there waiting to be discovered, mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about nature. And someday, somehow, I'm going to capture that perfect shot, the one that proves, once and for all, that sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the ones that are true. Story 23. I used to love road trips, the open highway, the changing landscape, the sense of adventure. But after what happened to my family on that lonely stretch of road in the Ozarks, I can't look at a map without my hands shaking. My name is Daniel Carter, and this is the story of how a simple wrong turn became a night of terror we'll never forget. It was supposed to be a fun family vacation. My wife Sarah, our 2 kids, Emma, 12, and Tyler, 8, and I, were driving from Chicago to my parents' place in Arkansas. We'd made the trip dozens of times before, but this time I decided to take a scenic detour through the Ozark Mountains. "It'll be an adventure," I said. If only I'd known what kind of adventure we were in for. We left later than planned, and as night fell, we found ourselves on a winding mountain road I didn't recognize. The GPS was useless, showing nothing but a blank space where the road should be. I wasn't worried at first. These things happen in remote areas. But as the hours ticked by and we saw no signs, no other cars, not even a glimpse of civilization, a sense of unease began to creep over me. "Dad, are we lost?" Emma asked from the back seat, her voice tinged with worry. "Of course not, sweetie," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're just taking the scenic route." Sarah shot me a look that said she wasn't buying it either. I could see the concern in her eyes, mirroring my own growing anxiety. It was just after midnight when we saw it, a massive shape, dark against the night sky, lumbering across the road ahead of us. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching on the asphalt. "What the hell was that?" Sarah gasped, clutching the dashboard. For a moment, we sat in stunned silence, the headlights illuminating empty road. Then Tyler's small voice piped up from the back. "Dad, look." I followed his pointing finger to the side of the road. There, half hidden in the shadows, was a pair of glowing eyes. But these weren't the reflective eyes of a deer or a raccoon. They were larger, set higher off the ground, and filled with an intelligence that made my blood run cold. "Lock the doors," I whispered, hitting the button on my side. As if triggered by the sound of the locks engaging, a low, rumbling growl filled the air. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, not quite human, but something in between that sent shivers down my spine. "Daniel, drive," Sarah urged, her voice tight with fear. I didn't need to be told twice. I threw the car into gear and sped off, my heart pounding. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of a massive, fur-covered shape emerging from the tree line. It was easily 8 feet tall, with long arms that nearly reached the ground, and it was fast, impossibly fast for something of its size. "It's chasing us!" Emma screamed, looking out the back window. I pressed harder on the accelerator, taking the winding road at speeds that made the tires squeal on every turn. But no matter how fast we went, I could hear it behind us, its heavy footfalls somehow keeping pace with our car. Suddenly, the road ahead disappeared into darkness. I slammed on the brakes just in time, the front wheels of our SUV teetering on the edge of where the pavement simply ended. It was as if the road had been swallowed by the forest. "What's happening?" Tyler whimpered, clinging to his sister. Before I could answer, something large slammed into the side of our car, rocking it dangerously close to the edge. Claws screeched against metal as the creature tried to find purchase. "Get down!" I yelled, throwing the car into reverse. We shot backwards, narrowly missing the beast as it lunged for us again. For what felt like hours, we played a terrifying game of cat and mouse. Every time I thought we'd lost it, the creature would appear again, sometimes in front of us, sometimes beside us, always too close for comfort. It was toying with us, I realized with growing horror. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. This thing was intelligent, calculating. As the first light of dawn began to streak the sky, we finally saw a sign of civilization, an old gas station, its neon open sign flickering weakly in the early morning gloom. I screeched into the parking lot, the tires leaving rubber on the cracked concrete. An old man emerged from the station, looking startled at our sudden arrival. "Please," I gasped as I scrambled out of the car. "You have to help us. There's something out there, something chasing us." The old man's expression shifted from surprise to something else, understanding, tinged with fear. "You saw it, didn't you?" he said quietly. "The Ozark Howler, some folks call it. Others have different names." As he spoke, I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching us, but there was nothing. Just the normal sounds of a forest waking up. The old man ushered us inside, locking the door behind us. Over stale coffee and packaged donuts, he told us stories, tales of hikers gone missing, of cars found abandoned on lonely stretches of road, of a creature that defied explanation stalking the forests of the Ozarks. "But why?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "Why did it chase us?" The old man shook his head. "Nobody knows for sure. Some say it's protecting its territory. Others think it's something older, something that doesn't belong in this world. All I know is you're lucky to have made it here alive." We stayed at the gas station until full daylight, too shaken to continue our journey. When we finally worked up the courage to leave, the old man gave us directions to the nearest town, warning us to stick to the main roads. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Even now, months later, I sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of that inhuman growl ringing in my ears. We reported our experience, of course, but the local authorities just shook their heads, talking about bears and mountain lions. They didn't believe us. Hell, I'm not sure I would have believed us if we hadn't lived through it, but we know what we saw. We know what chased us through the dark that night. And we can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting on some lonely stretch of road for unwary travelers to take a wrong turn. I don't take road trips anymore. The thought of being out there, vulnerable, with those intelligent eyes watching from the darkness, is more than I can bear. But I can't let it go either. I've become obsessed with understanding what's really out there, lurking in the shadows of our world. Sometimes, late at night when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear that unearthly growl carried on the breeze, and I lie awake, wondering about what other secrets those ancient forests might be hiding. So if you're ever driving through the mountains and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck like you're being watched, trust your instincts, because there are things out there, in the wild places of the world, that defy our understanding. Things that turn a simple wrong turn into a fight for survival, that lurk just beyond the reach of your headlights, waiting to be discovered. And if you do encounter something you can't explain, something that shouldn't exist outside of legend and myth, remember our story. Don't dismiss it, don't try to rationalize it away, because sometimes the monsters in our campfire stories are more real than we'd like to believe. And the only thing standing between you and them is how well you listen to that primal voice inside that tells you when it's time to hit the gas and never look back. As for my family and me, we've moved to the city. We tell ourselves we're here for better job opportunities, for the kids' education. But deep down, we know the truth. We're hiding, trying to lose ourselves in the sea of humanity, because we know that somewhere out there, in the dark forests and winding mountain roads, something is waiting, something that once had us in its grasp and let us go, and we can't shake the feeling that one day it might come looking for us again.